close your eyes for a moment and try to picture the world as it appears on any map you've ever seen. The coastlines, the continents, the islands scattered across blue oceans. Now imagine that everything you're picturing is wrong, not slightly inaccurate, but fundamentally incorrect. The shores you know, the beaches where cities now stand, the harbours where ships dock, none of them existed 12,000 years ago. The ocean was somewhere else entirely. We're told that human civilization began around 5,000 years ago in places like Sumer and Egypt, that before this there were only scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers living simple lives with simple tools. We're told that history is a straight line climbing upward from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to enlightened. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the textbooks are showing us only the final chapter of a much longer book, and all the preceding pages have been torn out and lost? Imagine standing on a beach at sunset, watching waves roll in across sand that stretches to the horizon. Now drop the ocean 400 feet. Suddenly you're standing on a cliff, and below you spreads a vast coastal plain extending miles and miles toward a distant sea. Cities could have stood there. Ports, temples, entire civilizations going about their lives, building and trading and watching these same stars we see tonight. All of it now rests beneath water so deep that sunlight has never touched those ruins in 10,000 years. Something happened approximately 12,000 years ago. Something catastrophic enough to erase nearly every trace of what came before. The geological record shows it. The ice cores preserve it. The myths remember it. Over 200 cultures around the world, separated by oceans and mountains, cultures that never met or traded or shared stories, all tell the same tale. The world ended in water. The old world drowned, and from the survivors came everything we now call history. There are structures standing today that shouldn't exist according to our accepted timeline. Stone monuments demonstrating mathematical precision that supposedly primitive people couldn't have possessed. Astronomical knowledge encoded in architecture that requires centuries of careful observation to develop, yet appearing suddenly, fully formed, without any evidence of the learning process that should have preceded it. Temples aligned to celestial events with accuracy that modern surveyors struggle to match. The standard explanation is that ancient people were simply more clever than we give them credit for, that given enough time and labor, anything can be accomplished with primitive tools, perhaps. But that explanation requires us to ignore certain uncomfortable questions. Why do the oldest structures often demonstrate the greatest sophistication? Why does Egyptian engineering appear to decline over time rather than improve? Why do mathematical constants like pi and phi appear in monuments supposedly built by people who hadn't yet invented writing? These aren't fringe questions asked only by conspiracy theorists in darkened rooms. These are gaps in the narrative that archaeologists themselves acknowledge, even if they disagree about what those gaps mean. The evidence exists. The anomalies are real. What remains disputed is the interpretation. So we begin this journey not with certainty, but with curiosity, not claiming to have all the answers, but willing to examine the questions that linger in the spaces between what we know and what we're told. The late night hours are good for this kind of thinking. When the world quiets and the usual distractions fade, the mind can wander into territories that daylight makes seem impossible. The coastlines were different. The climate was different. The very shape of the continents beneath our feet was different. And if the world was so thoroughly transformed, what else might have changed? What else might have been lost when the waters rose and the old world vanished beneath waves that have guarded its secrets ever since? We're about to explore a world that doesn't appear on any map, inhabited by people who left no names we can pronounce, who built cities that crumbled into the deep. But first, we need to understand who they were. Morning arrives differently when your city faces an ocean that no longer exists. The sun rises over waters that have been gone for 12,000 years, casting light across a harbour where now only fish swim through broken columns and crabs scuttle across floors that once knew the footsteps of crowds. Try to imagine waking in such a place, not as a primitive hunter crouched in a cave, but as someone living in a settlement that might have housed thousands, in a structure built with knowledge we assume didn't exist yet. The day begins before dawn, as it has for as long as anyone can remember. Fires are kindled with techniques passed down through generations, but perhaps not the crude friction methods we picture when we think of ancient people. There is evidence suggesting some pre-flood societies understood principles of engineering and construction that wouldn't reappear for thousands of years. The homes themselves might have incorporated designs we'd recognize, foundations set with astronomical alignments, walls positioned to capture specific angles of sunlight, ventilation systems that maintained comfortable temperatures without the need for constant heating or cooling. breakfast might have included grains we no longer cultivate, fruits from species that went extinct when the climate shifted, fish caught from reefs that are now at depths where only specialized equipment can reach. The assumption has always been that agriculture began around 10,000 years ago, a sudden invention that transformed human society. But what if it was a rediscovery? What if these morning meals represented knowledge that had been old even then? The work of the day would have varied by individual, by season, by need. We know from underwater archaeological surveys that structured settlements existed far earlier than conventional timelines suggest. Off the coast of India near Dwarka, sonar has mapped what appear to be walls and roads resting beneath 100 feet of water. Near Japan, the Yonaguni monument shows angular formations, right angle cuts, and what look like deliberate terracing, all at depth suggesting they were built when sea levels were far lower. Near Cuba, researchers have documented geometric patterns on the ocean floor at depths that would require these structures to be impossibly old by standard chronology. These aren't natural formations that imagination has turned into ruins. These are structured, patterned, deliberately shaped environments that now serve as homes for marine life, instead of the human communities that once gathered there. The reluctance to investigate them further stems partly from the implications. If these are genuine archaeological sites, then the timeline shifts, the story changes, and perhaps there is comfort in the story we already have, the one that makes sense, the one that doesn't require rewriting every textbook and reconsidering every assumption. But let's return to that morning, to that day in a world we can only reconstruct through fragments and guesses. Perhaps there were specialists among these communities, astronomers tracking celestial patterns through decades of observation, engineers directing the construction of monuments we now find submerged and mysterious, mathematicians developing systems of calculation that would later be credited to cultures thousands of years more recent. The sophistication wouldn't have been uniform. Some settlements likely were simple, others complex. Some populations might have lived as hunter-gatherers while others cultivated crops and built in stone. The relationship with the natural world would have been intimate in ways we've lost. The stars weren't obscured by light pollution. The seasons followed patterns not yet disrupted by industrial intervention. Animals that are now extinct walked landscapes that are now ocean floor. Mammoths and giant sloths weren't museum reconstructions but neighbors, threats, resources, parts of the living world that surrounded daily existence. As the sun sets over this vanished world, as the day's work concludes and fires are banked for the night, perhaps there were gatherings, stories told, knowledge shared, the oral traditions that would eventually become the myths we now study, the flood legends that cultures across the globe would preserve through catastrophe and carry forward into the world that followed. But what made this world possible? What environmental conditions allowed civilizations to flourish in places we now consider uninhabitable? The answer lies in understanding just how different the Earth itself once was. The planet you are sitting on right now is not the planet they walked upon. The very shape of the world has changed, transformed so completely that showing them a modern map would be like showing them an alien landscape. The difference wasn't gradual. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of change that erases civilizations and buries history beneath water and ice and time. During the last ice age, glaciers miles thick covered much of North America, Europe and Asia. These weren't just frozen landscapes. They were reservoirs holding unimaginable quantities of water that had been pulled from the oceans and locked into solid ice. Sea levels dropped nearly 400 feet below where they rest today. 400 feet. That is a 40-story building, worth of ocean, that simply wasn't there, exposing continental shelves we now consider deep ocean floor. Where today you need a submarine to explore, people once walked. Where modern ships navigate open water, there were coastal plains extending for miles, fertile lands fed by rivers that have long since drowned. The Persian Gulf was a river valley, possibly the location that inspired later memories of a garden paradise, an Eden that existed before the waters came. The Mediterranean was the sea we know, but a landscape of valleys and freshwater lakes, a completely different geography supporting completely different ecosystems. Indonesia and Australia weren't separate as they are now. A massive continental shelf called Sunderland connected them, a landmass larger than India that supported its own climate, its own populations, its own story. When the ice melted and the seas rose, Sunderland vanished almost entirely, leaving only the highest peaks as the islands we now call Indonesia and Malaysia. Everything else, the settlements, the roads, the evidence of whoever lived there, sank beneath tropical waters that have kept those secrets ever since. The climate itself was different in ways that seem almost impossible. Siberia, now a frozen wasteland, was temperate grassland where mammoths grazed in herds. The Sahara, now desert, was savanna with lakes and rivers supporting abundant life. The patterns of rainfall, the jet streams, the ocean currents, all of it operated according to configurations that no longer exist. The world was in many ways more hospitable, offering more livable land, more coastal territory, more opportunities for human populations to establish and grow. This is why the absence of evidence becomes less mysterious. If you are looking for pre-flood coastal cities, you are not going to find them on modern coastlines. You are going to find them hundreds of feet underwater, covered by sediment, transformed by millennia of current and pressure into formations that might not even look artificial anymore. We've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. We've systematically surveyed even less. The lost cities, if they exist, remain lost, not because they never were, but because we haven't looked in the right places. Then something changed. Around 12,800 years ago, the climate shifted dramatically. The Younger Dryas period began, a mysterious return to Ice Age conditions that happened far too quickly to be explained by gradual climate cycles. Temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly advanced again, and then, just as suddenly, around 11,600 years ago, it ended. The ice melted rapidly. The seas rose, and the world we know began to take shape from the ruins of what came before. The theories about what triggered this catastrophe vary. Some researchers point to asteroid or comet impacts, citing evidence of platinum anomalies in geological layers worldwide. Others suggest massive solar events or volcanic eruptions. What remains undisputed is that it happened, that it was dramatic, and that it coincided precisely with the mass extinction of megafauna and the supposed beginning of human civilization. Perhaps civilization didn't begin then. Perhaps it began again, rebuilt by survivors who carried fragments of knowledge from the world that drowned, knowledge that would surface in the monuments and mathematics and mysteries of cultures we only now beginning to understand were far older, far more connected, and far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. But to understand what they knew, we need to examine what they left behind. There are objects in museum collections that don't belong in their display cases, not because they were stolen or misplaced, but because according to everything we think we know about history, they shouldn't exist at all. Hold one of these artifacts in your hands and you can feel the wrongness of it, the way it sits in time like a puzzle piece, forced into the wrong section of a picture. The edges don't match, the context doesn't fit, and yet there it is, undeniably real, undeniably ancient, undeniably impossible. In 1901, divers exploring a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera pulled up a corroded lump of bronze that would take decades to understand. When researchers finally managed to examine its interior, they found a device of staggering complexity, a machine with dozens of precisely cut gears, calibrated to track the movements of celestial bodies, predict eclipses, and map astronomical cycles. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be called, represented a level of computational sophistication that supposedly didn't exist again until medieval astronomical clocks appeared more than 1,000 years later. It wasn't primitive. It wasn't a lucky accident. It was technology, deliberate and refined, created by minds that understood principles we assume they could have known. In Iraq, archaeologists excavating ancient Mesopotamian sites discovered clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods, components that, when filled with acidic liquid, generate electrical current. The Baghdad batteries, as they were called, shouldn't work, but they do. The standard explanation is that they were used for electroplating gold onto silver. But that explanation requires ancient Mesopotamians to have understood electrochemistry, a field we credit to scientists working thousands of years later. The alternative is that these weren't inventions at all, but remnants of knowledge inherited from somewhere, someone sometime before. Then there is the London hammer, a tool that looks entirely modern, wooden handle, iron head, except it was found encased in rock formation supposedly millions of years old. Geologists debate the dating. Skeptics question the context, but the hammer itself remains, refusing to fit comfortably into any timeline that makes sense. In the Temple of Dendera in Egypt, reliefs carved into stone walls show objects that look disturbingly like light bulbs, glass enclosures, filaments, what appears to be a power source. Egyptologists explain them as symbolic representations of mythological concepts, which may be true. But the specificity of the design, the technical precision of the depiction, leaves room for other interpretations. What if the symbols came first and the mythology later? What if these carvings preserved the memory of objects whose function was eventually forgotten, reinterpreted through the lens of religion when the original knowledge faded? There is a term for this kind of evidence: forbidden archaeology. Not forbidden in the sense of being illegal or hidden, but forbidden in the sense that it violates the established narrative. Academic institutions build careers on timelines and frameworks that took centuries to construct. When an artifact appears that doesn't fit, the pressure to explain it away, to recontextualize it, to minimize its implications, can be overwhelming. Paradigm shifts are uncomfortable. They require admitting that previous certainties were incomplete or wrong. They demand rewriting textbooks, reconfiguring theories, reconsidering assumptions that entire fields of study have built themselves upon. We like our history neat. We like progression that makes sense, primitive to advanced, simple to complex, ignorant to enlightened. Objects that violate this progression create cognitive dissonance, so we find ways to make them fit, or we quietly set them aside in storage facilities where they complicate the story we agreed to tell. But what if some of these artifacts aren't anachronisms? What if they re-evidence of continuity, fragments of knowledge that survived catastrophe, and were rediscovered by later cultures who didn't fully understand what they found? What if the reason we see occasional bursts of seemingly impossible sophistication in ancient contexts isn't because people got temporarily clever, but because they were working from blueprints, copying designs, following instructions handed down from a world that no longer existed? The objects whisper these questions. They sit in their cases corroded and mysterious, waiting for someone to hear what they were actually saying. But artifacts are portable, small, easy to dismiss as anomalies. What about the things too large to ignore, too massive to explain away? What about the structures? There are stones in this world that weigh more than 100 cars stacked together, cut with precision that would challenge modern laser-guided equipment, fitted so perfectly that you cannot slide a blade between them, positioned with astronomical alignments, accurate to fractions of a degree. And we retold they were moved and placed by people using copper chisels and rope. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands as perhaps the most analyzed structure in human history, yet it continues to defy complete explanation. Its base is leveled to within less than an inch across 13 acres. Its sides align to true north more accurately than the Greenwich Observatory built thousands of years later. The ratio of its height to its base perimeter encodes the mathematical constant pi with remarkable precision. Its internal chambers incorporate the golden ratio. The precision is accidental. The mathematics is coincidental. This was deliberate, calculated, executed with knowledge that supposedly didn't exist in 2500 BCE. The standard explanation involves massive labor forces, simple tools applied with great patience, and clever use of ramps that have never been found, and whose design remains theoretical because no one has successfully demonstrated how they would actually work at the required scale. It is possible. Many things are possible, given enough time and determination. But possibility isn't the same as probability, and the engineering challenges remain formidable, even with modern machinery. Travel to Bolivia and you'll find Puma Punku, where blocks of diorite and andesite, stones so hard they rank near diamond on the hardness scale, have been cut into interlocking shapes of extraordinary complexity. The precision is such that the blocks fit together like manufactured components, with perfectly flat surfaces and right angles that deviate by less than a millimeter. Some blocks show evidence of what appears to be machine tooling, with drill holes of uniform diameter and cuts that would require technology we assume didn't exist until the Industrial Revolution. Archaeologists date the site to around 500 CE, attributing it to the Tiwanaku culture. But there is no clear record of how they accomplished what modern stonemasons, even with diamond-tipped tools, struggle to replicate. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe stands as an archaeological impossibility that has forced reconsideration of what hunter-gatherers could achieve. Dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, it predates agriculture, predates pottery, predates metalworking, predates everything we thought necessary for constructing monumental architecture. Yet here are massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 20 tons, quarried from bedrock, transported across difficult terrain, and erected in circles with sophisticated artistic reliefs depicting animals and symbols whose meanings remain mysterious. The people who built this supposedly had no villages, no permanent settlements, no complex social organization. They were, according to conventional understanding, just beginning to transition from nomadic hunting to settled farming. And yet they created something that required planning, coordination, specialized knowledge, and sustained effort across what must have been decades or longer. Peru offers Sacsay Huamin, where limestone blocks weighing up to 200 tons are fitted together in polygonal patterns, so precise that you cannot slide paper between the joints. These aren't T-simple rectangular blocks. They irregular, multi-sided shapes that interlock like three-dimensional puzzles. Each block here surface matches its neighbors perfectly despite having different angles, different dimensions, different orientations. The mathematics required to calculate such fits would challenge modern architects. The physical process of cutting and positioning them remains unexplained despite numerous theories. The common thread across all these sites is that conventional explanations require us to believe that ancient peoples accomplished with primitive tools what we would find difficult with modern technology, that they developed sophisticated mathematical understanding without writing to record their calculations, that they transported multi-ton stones across mountains and valleys using methods that leave no archaeological trace, that they achieved precision we struggle to match using techniques we can only theorize about. Or perhaps these structures weren't built by the cultures we've credited with them. Perhaps they were inherited, already ancient when later civilizations found them, restored and claimed but not originally constructed. Perhaps the knowledge required to create such monuments existed in the pre-flood world and was partially imperfectly preserved by those who survived to rebuild in the aftermath. The stones themselves cannot tell us, but they stand, impossible and real, waiting for explanations that actually account for what they are rather than what we think they should be. Knowledge can be more durable than stone, more persistent than artifacts, more revealing than any physical structure. It hides in plain sight, encoded in monuments and myths, preserved in measurements and mathematics, waiting for minds ready to recognize what it represents. And when you begin to look for it, you find it everywhere, astronomical understanding that required centuries of continuous observation, mathematical constants that demand sophisticated calculation, scientific principles that supposedly weren't discovered until modern times. Stand at Stonehenge during the summer solstice and watch the sun rise precisely through the heel stone, exactly as it did when the monument was built nearly 5,000 years ago. The alignment isn't approximate, it's exact. And it's not just the solstices, megalithic sites worldwide, track equinoxes, lunar cycles, planetary movements, and even the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle taking 25,920 years to complete that mainstream history credits to Greek astronomers in the 2nd century BCE. Yet structures built thousands of years earlier demonstrate knowledge of this precession, incorporating it into their orientations and measurements. In Egypt's desert, Nabta Playa contains a stone circle predating Stonehenge by a millennium, aligned to track star positions from over 6,000 years ago, with understanding of celestial mechanics that should have been impossible for the nomadic people credited with building it. The precision suggests not casual skywatching, but systematic astronomical study conducted over generations. Knowledge preserved and applied with purpose, we can measure but not fully explain. The Hindu Yuga system describes cosmic cycles spanning millions of years, with specific mathematical relationships between the ages. The Mayan long count calendar tracks time with precision that accounts for stellar drift and requires astronomical observations sustained across centuries. Greek myths, when examined closely, encode planetary cycles and celestial mechanics that some researchers interpret as astronomical knowledge disguised as stories about gods and heroes. The question becomes, did these cultures all independently develop such sophisticated understanding, or were they preserving fragments of knowledge inherited from predecessors who mapped the heavens long before? Then there are the maps. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, incorporates coastline details of Antarctica as it appears beneath the ice, information that shouldn't have been available until the 20th century, when ground-penetrating radar revealed the continent's true shape. The mapmaker claimed to have worked from older sources, charts dating back centuries or millennia. If true, those source maps were drawn when Antarctica was either ice-free or mapped by people with technology to see through ice. Either possibility disrupts conventional chronology. The Orontius Phineus map shows similar impossible knowledge. Cartographers drew these maps from something. The question is what and when and how. Mathematical knowledge shows similar patterns of premature sophistication. Babylonian tablets demonstrate understanding of Pythagorean triples more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. The Mayans independently discovered and used zero as a mathematical concept, a breakthrough we credit to Indian mathematicians, but which appeared in Mesoamerica without any documented cultural exchange. The Great Pyramid encodes pi and phi in its dimensions, constants requiring advanced mathematics to calculate and apply. These aren't isolated accidents, but systematic incorporation of mathematical principles into monumental architecture. Ancient metallurgy presents similar mysteries. Damascus steel possessed properties that modern metallurgists cannot fully replicate, despite access to electron microscopes and advanced analysis. The process was lost, the knowledge gone, leaving us with artifacts we can study but not reproduce. Roman concrete still stands after 2,000 years, outlasting modern formulations that crumble after decades. The recipe was lost when the empire fell. Ancient chemical knowledge, preserved in texts like the Egyptian Ebers Papyrus and the Indian Sushruta Samhita, describes surgical procedures and anatomical understanding that seems impossibly advanced for its era. Brain surgery, plastic surgery, knowledge of circulation, and nervous systems that supposedly wasn't discovered until Renaissance anatomists began systematic dissection. The pattern repeats across disciplines and cultures. Knowledge appearing fully formed, sophisticated understanding without evidence of the developmental process that should have preceded it, capabilities that seem anachronistic in their contexts. The conventional explanation is independent discovery, parallel development, the inevitable forward march of human intelligence, eventually reaching similar conclusions. Perhaps these aren't discoveries at all but rememberings, fragments of comprehensive scientific understanding, possessed by pre-flood civilizations and imperfectly transmitted through catastrophe to cultures that preserved what they could, applied what they understood, and lost what they couldn't maintain. The knowledge whispers of its origins, if we're willing to listen. But listening means accepting that what destroyed those origins was real, catastrophic, and comprehensive enough to erase nearly everything except these scattered traces. Imagine looking up and seeing the sky on fire, not metaphorically, not poetically, but actually burning. The atmosphere itself igniting as objects from space tore through it, at velocities that turned air into plasma. That is what happened approximately 12,800 years ago, according to a theory that is moved from fringe speculation to serious scientific consideration, as evidence continues to accumulate in layers of ancient Earth. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck Earth across the northern hemisphere in a series of devastating impacts. Not one massive collision, but multiple strikes, a cosmic shotgun blast that hit ice sheets, oceans, and land across a span of hours or days. The friction of these objects entering the atmosphere would have created thermal radiation intense enough to ignite forests across entire continents. The shockwaves would have circled the globe, and the immediate aftermath would have been darkness as dust and debris rose into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and plunging temperatures within weeks or even days. This isn't science fiction. There is physical evidence embedded in the geological record. Researchers have found a platinum anomaly in sediment layers worldwide, all dating to this exact period. Platinum is rare in Earth's crust, but abundant in asteroids and comets. Its presence in concentrations far above background levels suggests extraterrestrial material scattered across the planet. Alongside the platinum are nanodiamonds, microscopic crystals that form only under conditions of extreme heat and pressure, the kind generated by cosmic impacts. Magnetic spherules appear in the same layers, tiny balls of melted and solidified material consistent with impact events. Then there is the black mat, a layer of sediment found across North America, containing massive concentrations of carbon and soot, evidence of wildfires on a continental scale. Not isolated burns, but synchronized destruction, forests and grasslands, burning simultaneously across thousands of miles. The layer appears suddenly in the geological record, a dark line separating what came before from what came after. What came after was extinction. North American megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant ground sloths, American lions, camels, and dozens of other species. vanished within what appears to be a geological instant. Mainstream science attributes this to gradual climate change and human overhunting. But the timeline is remarkably abrupt. Animals that had survived previous climate fluctuations, that had coexisted with human hunters for thousands of years, suddenly disappeared in synchrony with this cosmic bombardment. Beneath Greenland, ice sheet, researchers have identified the Hiawatha crater, a massive impact structure, approximately 30 kilometers across, dated to roughly the right period. Similar potential impact sites have been identified in the Great Lakes region. The evidence builds layer by layer, paper by paper, discovery by discovery, shifting the hypothesis from controversial to plausible to increasingly probable. For human populations, the effects would have been immediate and catastrophic. Coastal civilizations would have faced tsunamis generated by ocean impacts, walls of water, hundreds of feet high, obliterating everything in their path. Inland populations would have experienced the thermal pulse, the shock waves, and then the onset of rapid climate collapse as temperatures plummeted. Food sources would have vanished within seasons, megafauna dying from the environmental shock, plant life struggling to survive under darkened skies, agricultural systems collapsing as growing seasons shortened or disappeared entirely. The Clovis culture offers a haunting example. These were sophisticated Paleolithic people who dominated North America, distinguished by their advanced stone tool technology and widespread presence across the continent. Around 12,800 years ago, they vanished. Sites that show continuous Clovis occupation suddenly stop. The distinctive tools disappear from the archaeological record. What follows is a period of disruption, of different, less sophisticated technologies, of populations apparently scattered and diminished. This is what extinction looks like in the archaeological record. Not dramatic scenes of final battles or last stands, but simply absence where there was once presence, silence where there was once activity, an empty chapter where the story should have continued. In the span of a single generation, the world didn't just change, it ended, and from its ashes crawled the survivors we call our ancestors, carrying what fragments they could preserve into a future that would remember the catastrophe only as myth. But what if the sky falling was only the beginning? What if the impact triggered a cascade of secondary catastrophes, each one amplifying the destruction until the planet itself became a hostile, alien place where survival was measured not in years but in days? Consider the Earth not as a solid sphere, but as it actually is, a thin crust floating on a molten interior, tectonic plates in constant slow motion, a delicate balance maintained by forces we're only beginning to understand. Charles Hapgood proposed that this crust could, under certain conditions, slide rapidly over the interior, displacing continents by thousands of miles in a matter of years or even days. This isn't T-magnetic pole reversal, which happens regularly and is well documented. This isn't T-continental drift, which moves landmasses at the pace of growing fingernails. This is rapid crustal displacement, a wholesale repositioning of the planet's surface. Albert Einstein found the theory compelling enough to write the foreword to Hapgood's book, Earth's Shifting Crust, lending his considerable reputation to an idea mainstream geology rejected. The evidence Hapgood pointed to remains puzzling. Tropical plant fossils in Antarctica, suggesting that frozen continent was once positioned in temperate latitudes. Sudden climate shifts in various regions that seem too rapid for conventional explanations. And ancient structures whose astronomical alignments no longer match the celestial positions they were designed to track. Then there is the sun itself. Our star is not the stable, benign presence we imagine, but a variable reactor capable of violent outbursts. Coronal mass ejections and solar flares of unprecedented magnitude could strip away portions of Earth's atmosphere, generate electromagnetic pulses that disrupt everything from the planet's magnetic field to the electrical processes in living cells, and trigger climate changes through mechanisms we're only now beginning to study. Ice cores from the Younger Dryas period show unusual isotopic signatures that some researchers interpret as evidence of solar bombardment, cosmic radiation reaching Earth's surface in concentrations that should have been blocked by a healthy atmosphere. Lake Agassiz covered much of central North America during the Ice Age, held back by walls of ice that contained more water than all of Earth's current lakes combined. When those ice dams failed, the release would have been catastrophic. Water equivalent to the Mediterranean Sea, pouring into the oceans within weeks, raising global sea levels by meters, disrupting ocean currents, flooding coastlines worldwide. And Lake Agassiz wasn't tea alone. Similar glacial lakes existed across the northern hemisphere. Each one a catastrophe, waiting for the moment when ice could no longer contain the pressure. Volcanic activity adds another layer to this apocalyptic scenario. The Toba super eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago, ejected more than 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, triggering a volcanic winter that lasted years and may have reduced human populations to as few as 10,000 individuals worldwide. During the Younger Dryas, increased volcanic activity appears in the geological record. Whether triggered by crustal instability from impacts, by rapid climate change affecting tectonic stresses, or by some combination of factors, the result would have been ash clouds, acid rain, further cooling, and continued agricultural collapse. The terrifying possibility isn't that any one of these catastrophes occurred, but that they occurred together, each one triggering or amplifying the others. Cosmic impacts destabilizing the crustal movement, triggering volcanic eruptions, eruptions combining with impact debris to block sunlight, solar activity stripping atmospheric protection, ice dams failing under the stress of rapid geological change, floods disrupting ocean currents and triggering further climate chaos. Not one catastrophe, but a symphony of destruction, each instrument playing its part in transforming Earth from a habitable world into a survival nightmare. For populations trying to endure this cascade, there would have been no safe place, no refuge that remained stable, no adaptation that worked for long because the conditions kept changing. What worked in the immediate aftermath of impact wouldn't work during the volcanic winter. What worked during the winter would work when the floods came. What worked when the floods receded wouldn't work if the crust shifted and familiar territories found themselves in new climate zones. This is how civilizations end completely. This is how knowledge gets lost so thoroughly that its existence becomes disputed. This is how the world forgets. But somehow, impossibly, people survived. Genetic evidence tells a story more dramatic than any myth. Analysis of human DNA suggests that around 12,000 years ago, our species experienced a population bottleneck, a crash so severe that all modern humans may descend from as few as 10,000 individuals. 10,000 people on the entire planet. The math is sobering. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, carries genetic markers tracing back to this tiny remnant population that endured when everyone else perished. Think about what survival would have meant under those conditions. When the sky burned and the earth shook, when darkness fell and stayed for months or years, when temperatures plummeted and food sources vanished, the survivors weren't necessarily the most advanced or sophisticated. They were the fortunate. Those in the right locations, high enough to escape the floods, far enough from impact zones to avoid immediate destruction, positioned where some ecosystem remained viable when most others collapsed. Those with wilderness skills that mattered more than astronomical knowledge when every day was a struggle to find food and shelter. Those inland and elevated while coastal populations, possibly including the most advanced centers of pre-flood civilization, drowned beneath tsunamis and rising seas. There is a cruel irony in that pattern. The cities with sophisticated infrastructure, the coastal settlements with trade networks and specialized knowledge, the places where civilization flourished, these were precisely the locations most vulnerable to water-based catastrophe. Meanwhile, small groups living in mountains, in caves, in regions we might have considered primitive, had the geographical advantage that determined survival. The meek, in a very literal sense, inherited the earth simply by being in places the catastrophe could immediately reach. But survival alone doesn't preserve civilization. Knowledge is fragile, in ways stone and metal are not. When populations crash, when specialists die without transmitting their expertise, when survival becomes so desperate that abstract learning seems irrelevant to the immediate need for food and warmth. Cultural amnesia happens quickly. Within a generation, you lose the details. Within 2 or 3, you lose the technical knowledge. Within 10, you are left with stories that may or may not accurately reflect what was lost. Yet fragments persisted, oral traditions encoded in myths and legends, knowledge too important to forget passed from survivor to survivor, from parent to child, through decades and centuries until the world stabilized enough that writing could preserve it more permanently. The flood myths we discussed earlier, over 200 cultures preserving remarkably consistent accounts. These are what remained when everything else was lost. Not technical manuals but cautionary tales, not histories but mythologies, not facts but truths wrapped in narrative that could survive when paper and stone could not. Some survivors may have carried more than stories. The 7 sages of Sumerian mythology who brought civilization to humanity after a great flood. The Viracocha of South American legend who appeared after cataclysm to teach agriculture and astronomy. The Egyptian Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, described as preserving ancient wisdom through periods of chaos. These figures appear across cultures as civilizing heroes, teachers who possessed knowledge that seemed to come from nowhere, who understood principles that local populations had to be taught, rather than discovering independently. What if these weren't gods or mythological inventions, but actual survivors from more advanced pre-flood societies? Small groups who preserved fragments of astronomical knowledge, agricultural techniques, architectural principles, mathematical understanding, who emerged from their refuges after generations to find the world transformed and populated by peoples who had lost or never possessed such knowledge, who became teachers and were remembered as something more than human, because their capabilities seemed superhuman in comparison to those who had survived through luck rather than sophistication. The sudden appearance of advanced civilizations around 3000 BCE, Sumer with its writing and mathematics, Egypt with its architecture and astronomy, the Indus Valley with its urban planning, might not represent humanity inventing civilization for the first time. It might represent humanity recovering civilization, reaching sufficient population and stability to support complex societies again, implementing knowledge preserved through the dark centuries when such knowledge was maintained, but could be fully applied because basic survival consumed all resources and attention. We all descendants of that remnant. Every person reading this, every human alive, carries the legacy of 10,000 survivors who endured the apocalypse. They crawled from caves and ruins carrying memories of a world no one would believe existed, and became the foundation of everything that followed. Around 4000 BCE, something remarkable happened in the flatlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. A civilization appeared that shouldn't have been possible. Not a gradual development from simple villages to complex cities, but a sudden flowering of sophistication that seems to violate everything we think we know about cultural evolution. The Sumerians arrived on the stage of history, already knowing things that supposedly took other cultures millennia to discover. They had writing, not primitive pictographs, but a fully developed system of cuneiform capable of recording everything from poetry to astronomical calculations. They had mathematics based on a sexagesimal system counting in 60s, the same base -60 framework we still use for measuring time and angles 4,000 years later. They had detailed star catalogues tracking celestial movements with precision that required sustained observation across generations. They had sophisticated irrigation networks transforming desert into farmland through engineering principles that shouldn't have existed yet. They had patterned cities with urban planning, demonstrating understanding of geometry and social organization. They had written law codes establishing governance structures of remarkable complexity. The conventional narrative tells us that humans spent hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, then suddenly, within just a few thousand years, invented agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and urban civilization. The timeline seems almost deliberately compressed, as if history itself is rushing to explain how we got from primitive to advanced without acknowledging what might have existed in between. But the Sumerians themselves told a different story. Their texts speak of the Apkal, 7 sage beings who emerged from the sea after a great flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Not humans who invented these arts, but teachers who brought knowledge from somewhere else, from some time before. The Sumerian kings lists record rulers before the flood with reign periods, spanning thousands of years, followed by more realistic lengths afterward. Mainstream scholars dismiss these as mythological exaggeration. But what if they represent something else? Mythologized memory, perhaps, distant recollection of pre-flood times when measurement and record keeping operated differently, or when the concept of rain meant something we no longer understand. Egypt presents a similar puzzle. The civilization appears in the archaeological record already sophisticated, and the Great Pyramid, built supposedly just centuries after Egypt unified, represents engineering and mathematical knowledge that later dynasties demonstrably could not replicate. Egyptian history does show the progressive improvement you expect from a culture learning and developing over time. Instead, it shows a pattern of decline. The earliest monuments demonstrate the greatest precision. The oldest architecture incorporates the most advanced mathematics. Later periods attempt to copy what earlier generations achieved, but fall short, as if working from incomplete instructions for processes they don't fully understand. The Indus Valley Civilization emerged around 3300 BCE with urban planning, so sophisticated that cities featured standardized weights and measures, advanced sewage systems, and grid layouts suggesting central planning and mathematical precision. They had metallurgy, they had a written language, we still can, they had trade networks extending thousands of miles, and there is minimal evidence of developmental stages, no clear progression from simple to complex. The civilization flourishes for over a millennium, and then declines, leaving behind mysteries we're still trying to solve. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. Advanced capabilities appearing suddenly, fully formed, without the experimental phase that should precede mastery. It is as if these civilizations were working from templates, following patterns established by predecessors, rebuilding according to plans preserved from before. The alternative requires believing in remarkable coincidences, that multiple isolated cultures simultaneously and independently discovered complex mathematics, developed sophisticated astronomy, invented writing systems, and established urban planning principles all within a remarkably compressed timeline. Or perhaps they weren't discovering. Perhaps they were remembering. Perhaps the knowledge came not from gradual invention, but from careful preservation. Fragments passed down from survivors who had seen these principles applied in the world that drowned, who carried forward what they could, and waited for the day when humanity was ready to receive it again. They built perfect cities before they supposedly invented the wheel, unless someone had already shown them how. Knowledge leaves fingerprints. When you find advanced understanding appearing in contexts where it shouldn't exist, where there is no clear path of development leading to it, you are looking at evidence of something that doesn't fit the timeline we reconstructed. And these fingerprints are everywhere once you know to look for them. Take Egyptian stoneworking. We find evidence of precision drilling in granite and diorite. Stone so hard that modern craftsmen using diamond-tipped tools struggle to match the accuracy. The drill holes are perfectly circular, maintaining consistent diameter through depths of several feet, showing feed rates that would require significant pressure and rotational speed. Yet there is no developmental progression in the archaeological record. No practice pieces, no failed attempts, no gradual improvement from crude to refined. Just immediate mastery, appearing as if the techniques were already known, rather than being discovered through experimentation. The Baghdad batteries sit in museums, ceramic jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods that, when filled with acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, generate measurable electrical current. The standard explanation suggests they were used for electroplating gold onto silver. But that explanation requires ancient Mesopotamians to understand electrochemistry millennia before Luigi Galvani supposedly discovered it in 1780. The alternative is that these weren't inventions but remnants, copies of technology whose original purpose was forgotten, replicated by people who didn't fully understand what they were reproducing. In the ruins of Nimrud, archaeologists found a piece of worked crystal functioning as a magnifying lens dated to approximately 700 BCE. It is not crude or accidental. It is deliberately shaped, ground and polished with precision that indicates understanding of optical principles. Similar lenses have been found in other ancient contexts where they theoretically shouldn't exist, suggesting knowledge of optics that predates conventional discovery by centuries or millennia. The Antikythera mechanism represents perhaps the most dramatic example of anachronistic sophistication. This device uses differential gearing, a mechanical principle supposedly not reinvented until the medieval period, to track planetary movements and predict eclipses with accuracy, requiring detailed astronomical observations sustained across generations. It is not a primitive attempt at computation. It is a refined instrument demonstrating mastery of both mechanical engineering and mathematical astronomy. Ancient star charts show knowledge of stellar precession, the slow wobble of Earth, S-axis that causes the positions of stars to shift gradually over a cycle lasting 25,920 years. Detecting this phenomenon requires continuous observation across many human lifetimes. Yet monuments built thousands of years ago incorporate compensations for precession into their astronomical alignments, suggesting either impossibly long observation periods or inherited knowledge from predecessors who had already mapped these movements. Medical texts present similar mysteries. The Egyptian Ebers papyrus describes surgical procedures, including brain surgery, with apparent understanding of neurological functions. The Indian Sushruta Samhita details plastic surgery techniques and demonstrates anatomical knowledge that shouldn't have been accessible without systematic dissection. Chinese acupuncture maps show detailed understanding of nervous and circulatory systems that conventional medical history claims was discovered until much later. These aren't lucky guesses, they re-systematic knowledge applied with precision. Navigation presents perhaps the most intriguing anomalies. Polynesians crossed vast Pacific distances using sophisticated understanding of currents, stars, and wave patterns that modern sailors struggled to comprehend even with instruments. Evidence suggests transoceanic contact that supposedly didn't occur. Cocaine and tobacco residue found in Egyptian mummies, despite these plants being native only to the Americas. Artwork depicting species that shouldn't have been known outside their native continents. Genetic markers suggesting population movements that conventional timelines don't accommodate. The pattern becomes undeniable when you examine it comprehensively. In metallurgy, in optics, in astronomy, in medicine, in navigation, in mathematics, across disciplines and across cultures, you find knowledge appearing fully formed, not developing through obvious trial and error, but emerging as if remembered rather than discovered. Not progressing from primitive understanding to sophisticated application, but appearing already sophisticated from the earliest examples we can find. Either we re-witnessing the most remarkable series of independent coincidences in history, multiple isolated cultures simultaneously achieving similar breakthroughs without contact or communication, or we re-seeing fragments of a more comprehensive knowledge base that predated all of them, knowledge preserved imperfectly through catastrophe, transmitted incompletely through generations, applied partially by successor cultures that inherited wisdom they could fully replicate, but could sometimes successfully implement. The fingerprints suggest not invention, but inheritance. Not discovery, but recovery of what was already known. Knowledge without guardians dies quickly. When civilizations collapse, when populations scatter, when survival consumes all attention, the first casualty is always abstract learning, unless someone deliberately chooses to preserve it. Unless institutions form around the specific purpose of protecting wisdom through the chaos, knowledge vanishes within generations. And throughout history, such institutions have existed. Organizations dedicated to guarding secrets they considered too important or too dangerous for common knowledge. The Egyptian priesthood operated on strict hierarchical principles. Knowledge was parceled out according to rank and initiation. Outer teachings for common priests, inner mysteries for those who proved worthy through years of study and demonstration of character. Temple complexes at Karnak and Dendera functioned not just as places of worship, but as schools where astronomy, geometry, and esoteric principles were transmitted from master to student through carefully controlled processes. The knowledge wasn't written in plain language where anyone could access it. It was encoded in symbols, embedded in rituals, protected by oaths that made revealing sacred teachings to the uninitiated a crime punishable by death. The Library of Alexandria supposedly held over 500,000 scrolls, representing accumulated knowledge from across the ancient world. Texts in dozens of languages, covering everything from mathematics to medicine, astronomy to engineering, philosophy to practical crafts. When it burned, possibly multiple times across different historical periods, the loss was catastrophic. How much understanding disappeared in those flames? How many techniques, how many discoveries, how many preserved records of older civilizations were reduced to ash and scattered smoke? The destruction of knowledge repositories follows a tragic pattern through history. Spanish conquistadors burning Mayan codices, destroying what might have been comprehensive records of astronomical observations and cultural memory, leaving only 4 codices surviving from what was once a vast library of learning. The burning of Nalanda in India, where Buddhist texts and philosophical writings, accumulated over centuries, went up in flames that supposedly burned for months. The loss of countless texts during the fall of Rome, during the Mongol invasions, during the endless succession of wars and religious persecutions that have characterized human history. The Eleusinian mysteries endured for nearly 2,000 years in ancient Greece. Initiates underwent elaborate preparation and ceremony to receive teachings that were never written down, transmitted only through direct experience and sworn to absolute secrecy. We know the mysteries existed. We know they profoundly affected those who experienced them, including many of Greece's greatest philosophers and leaders. But we don't know what they actually taught because the secrecy held. The knowledge died with the last initiated priests, lost when the mysteries were finally suppressed, and the transmission chain was broken. The Pythagorean school operated as both mathematical academy and spiritual society, preserving knowledge of sacred geometry and numerology. that members believed revealed fundamental truths about reality itself. They developed or preserved understanding of mathematical relationships, acoustic principles, and geometric patterns that would be fully explored again until the Renaissance. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, through years of study under masters who judged when students were ready for deeper teachings. Some of this ancient wisdom survived through unexpected routes. Islamic scholars translated and preserved Greek and Egyptian texts during Europe's Dark Ages, maintaining knowledge that would have otherwise been lost when Roman civilization collapsed. Byzantine libraries kept classical learning alive when Western Europe descended into centuries of relative ignorance. Esoteric traditions like Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Kabbalah claimed direct lineage to ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian wisdom, preserving teachings through initiatory systems that paralleled the ancient mystery schools. The question of medieval and Renaissance secret societies remains controversial. Did the Knights Templar discover something during their occupation of Temple Mount in Jerusalem? Some cache of ancient texts or artifacts that contained preserved knowledge? Do the Rosicrucians and Freemasons preserve fragmented wisdom passed down through genuine continuity? Or did they reconstruct lost traditions through research and imagination? The symbolic systems these organizations use incorporate geometry, astronomy, and architectural principles that echo ancient knowledge. Whether that represents actual transmission or deliberate revival may be less important than recognizing the pattern to the human instinct to preserve and protect knowledge, considered sacred or dangerous. They hid the wisdom in temples and tombs. They encrypted it in symbols and rituals. They swore blood oaths to guard secrets that could remake the world or end it. And some of those secrets survived the burning libraries, survived the fall of empires, survived the catastrophes that erased civilizations. Not complete, not perfect, but enough fragments to whisper of what was lost and what might still be recovered if we learn to listen. Every culture remembers the water rising. Not some cultures, not most cultures. Every culture that has preserved oral traditions or written records going back far enough contains an account of catastrophic flooding that destroyed the world and forced humanity to begin again. The consistency is remarkable. The details vary, the names change, the theological frameworks differ, but the core narrative remains essentially identical across civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, cultures that never met, never traded, never shared stories around common fires. The biblical account of Noah is perhaps the most famous in Western consciousness. Divine judgment on a corrupt world, one righteous family chosen for survival, a massive boat built to specific dimensions, animals preserved in pairs, 40 days and nights of rain, waters covering the mountains, eventual landing on Ararat, a rainbow covenant promising never again. The story is so familiar, it's easy to forget how extraordinary its claims are. Worldwide inundation, total destruction of previous civilization, survival through maritime refuge, the world reborn from a handful of survivors. But Noah's flood isn't unique. It's one version of a story told everywhere. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia centuries before the biblical text, describes Utnapishtim surviving a God-sent deluge by building a boat according to divine instructions, preserving his family and representatives of all living things, weathering the storm, and eventually finding land on a mountain where he made offerings to the gods. The parallels to Noah aren't superficial. They're structural, suggesting either one tradition borrowing from the other, or both preserving memory of the same event through different cultural lenses. Hindu tradition tells of Matsya Avatar, where the god Vishnu manifests as a fish to warn Manu of coming catastrophe. Manu builds a boat, preserves the 7 sages and seeds of all plants, survives the deluge that destroys the world, and becomes the progenitor of humanity's next age. In China, Yu the Great channeled floodwaters and restored order after deluge threatened to destroy civilization entirely. The details differ from Middle Eastern accounts, but the fundamental pattern persists: catastrophic flooding, heroic survival, civilization rebuilt from ruins. Native American traditions across both continents preserve flood accounts. The Ojibwe tell of Nanabojo, surviving the Great Flood on a raft with animals, sending down various creatures to find Earth, eventually rebuilding the world from mud, brought up from beneath the waters. The Hopi describe multiple worlds destroyed by water before the current era, each destruction followed by emergence into a new world. Aztec legend speaks of the water-sun age ending in catastrophic flood. The Maya Popol Vuh describes gods destroying earlier human creations with deluge before successfully creating the current humanity. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime preserves stories of massive flooding that separated Tasmania from the mainland, a memory that, if accurate, would have to date back over 10,000 years to when sea levels were low enough for Tasmania to be connected. Pacific Islander legends across thousands of miles of ocean tell of islands sinking, populations fleeing to higher ground, entire landmasses vanishing beneath waves. Greek mythology describes Deucalion's flood, where Zeus destroys humanity with water, and only a righteous couple survives to repopulate the earth. Norse tradition includes in Ragnarok the image of world-drowning waters, the end of the current age beneath rising seas. The consistent elements across these geographically and culturally isolated traditions are striking. Divine warning of coming catastrophe, righteous individuals or families chosen for survival, boats or rafts built to preserve life, waters rising to cover the world, landing on mountains or high ground, seeds, animals, or knowledge deliberately preserved, the world eventually drying, allowing humanity to begin again. These aren't vague similarities that require creative interpretation. These are specific, detailed parallels in narratives that supposedly developed independently. The standard explanation suggests that flood myths are natural because humans settled near water and experienced local flooding. River valleys flood, coastlines erode, tsunamis strike. Communities near water would naturally develop stories about catastrophic inundation. Perhaps. But does that explain the global consistency? Does it account for the specific details about worldwide destruction rather than local disaster? Does it address the fact that these aren't described as regional events, but as complete resets of human civilization? Either hundreds of isolated cultures independently invented remarkably similar fictional catastrophes, or they're all preserving memory distorted, mythologized, interpreted through different theological frameworks of the same real event. The myths don't just remember the flood. They remember what came before. They preserve descriptions of the civilizations that existed in the world that drowned, the societies whose achievements were so great that their destruction required divine intervention. And those descriptions are worth examining carefully because they might contain actual historical memory wrapped in layers of mythology and time. Plato's account of Atlantis appears in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, presented not as philosophical allegory, but as historical record received from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, claiming to preserve knowledge far older than Greek civilization. The priests placed Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon's time, approximately 11,500 years ago, coinciding almost exactly with the Younger Dryas period and the proposed cataclysm we've been examining. Plato describes a sophisticated island civilization with concentric rings of land and water, elaborate temples incorporating multiple metals, advanced architecture and infrastructure, powerful military forces that conquered much of Europe and North Africa, and technology involving alloys and engineering principles beyond what contemporary Greece possessed. Scholars have debated for millennia whether Plato invented Atlantis as philosophical metaphor or recorded genuine tradition. But the specific details he provides, the date, the location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the sudden destruction by earthquake and flood in a single day and night, these read less like philosophical invention and more like preserved account, however distorted by time and transmission. Other traditions describe similar lost civilizations. Lemuria or Mu appears in Pacific and Asian accounts as a vast continent in the Indian or Pacific Ocean, home to advanced civilization before catastrophic sinking left only scattered islands. The Hyperboreans of Greek tradition lived in the far north in a land of eternal spring, possessing wisdom and capabilities that later Greeks could only wonder at, until some catastrophe ended their golden age. Jewish and early Christian apocryphal texts describe antediluvian civilizations of remarkable sophistication, pre-flood humanity achieving technological advancement that wouldn't be matched again for millennia. The consistent theme across these accounts is advancement followed by corruption, material progress divorced from ethical development. Civilizations that achieved great things but lost their way, fell into hubris, abused their knowledge, and invited either divine judgment or natural catastrophe as consequence. The biblical account emphasizes moral corruption. The earth was filled with violence. Greek versions stress human wickedness and pride. Hindu texts describe declining virtue through successive ages until the current era requires destruction and renewal. The Book of Enoch and related Jewish apocryphal texts describe the Watchers, angels or beings from elsewhere, who descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy and weapon-making, cosmetics and enchantments, astronomy and divination. The mixing of these teachings with humanity resulted in hybrid offspring, corrupted civilization, and eventual divine decision to cleanse the world through flood. Modern readers naturally interpret this through theological frameworks. But what if the core memory is more literal than we assume? What if the Watchers were survivors from more advanced pre-flood populations teaching less developed groups, their superior knowledge making them seem godlike, their intermarriage creating hybrid cultures that combined advanced technique with primitive contexts? The myths preserve descriptions of pre-flood technology that seem fantastic until you consider they might be distorted memories of real capabilities. Hindu epics describe Vimanas flying machines of various types, with specific technical details about their construction and operation. Various traditions mention weapons of terrifying destructive power, descriptions that some researchers find uncomfortably similar to nuclear or directed energy weapons. Later esoteric traditions attribute to Atlantis crystal-based power systems and technologies we can barely imagine. Separating historical memory from mythological embellishment becomes nearly impossible after millennia of oral transmission and cultural reinterpretation. But the pattern persists across too many isolated traditions to dismiss entirely. Advanced civilizations, great achievements, corruption or misuse of knowledge, catastrophic destruction. Survival of the righteous or fortunate, knowledge preserved in fragments by those who endured. The gods were too powerful. The angels taught forbidden secrets. The civilizations grew so advanced that heaven itself struck them down. Or so the stories claim. But what if the stories, beneath their theological frameworks and symbolic language, preserve genuine memory? What if the reason every culture remembers advanced pre-flood civilizations is because such civilizations actually existed, achieved remarkable things, made terrible mistakes, and paid the ultimate price? The myths might be our ancestors' way of ensuring we remember not just that it happened, but why. The flood myths don't just preserve memory of what happened, they preserve warnings about why it happened. And those warnings feel disturbingly relevant when you examine them carefully, as if the ancients were trying to tell their descendants something crucial about the relationship between knowledge, power, and survival. Divine judgment appears as a consistent theme across cultural variations. The catastrophe wasn't random. It wasn't arbitrary cosmic bad luck. It came as response to human behavior, to choices made, to lines crossed. The biblical account emphasizes that the earth was filled with violence, moral corruption, reaching levels that made destruction inevitable. Greek versions describe humanity's increasing wickedness and pride offending the gods. Hindu traditions track declining virtue through successive ages, each one worse than the last, until the accumulated corruption requires catastrophic reset and renewal. The religious frameworks vary, but beneath them lies a pattern that might preserve more than theological speculation. What if these accounts remember civilizations that did misuse their capabilities, that did pursue destructive technologies without considering consequences, that did create unsustainable systems that eventually collapsed catastrophically? The moral judgment in the myths might be later interpretation, but the core memory of advancement leading to catastrophe might be historical. The theme of forbidden knowledge appears repeatedly across traditions, always with the same implication that certain capabilities carry inherent dangers, that some understanding should perhaps remain unknown, that progress without wisdom invites disaster. Genesis presents the tree of knowledge, where gaining understanding comes with the price of exile from paradise. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humanity metallurgy, weaponry, and other arts that enable both creation and destruction. Greek mythology offers Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, bringing advancement but also suffering. The pattern suggests recognition that knowledge itself is neutral, but its application determines whether it builds or destroys. This isn't primitive superstition. This is sophisticated philosophical understanding that technological capability, without corresponding ethical development, creates existential risk. And the ancients apparently knew this, not through abstract reasoning but through experience, through witnessing or inheriting memory of what happens when power exceeds wisdom. The modern parallels make these ancient warnings feel uncomfortably prescient. Nuclear weapons represent knowledge that could destroy civilization in hours, capability that can't be uninvented, power that requires perfect wisdom and restraint forever to avoid catastrophic deployment. Genetic engineering raises fundamental questions about the limits of human modification of life, about what we should do versus what we can do. Artificial intelligence threatens to surpass human intelligence and potentially escape human control. Climate change results from technological capabilities deployed for short-term benefit without sufficient consideration of long-term consequences. We face the same pattern the myths describe: advancing knowledge, increasing power, questionable wisdom, potential catastrophe. The difference is that we have the myths as warnings, as preserved memory of what happens when this pattern plays out to its conclusion. Whether we'll heed those warnings remains uncertain. The myths also preserve the concept of cyclical time, of rise and fall as recurring pattern, rather than linear progression. Hindu yugas describe vast cycles of creation and destruction. Mayan world ages track successive creations and catastrophes. Greek tradition speaks of golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages, each one declining from the previous until reset becomes necessary. This isn't mystical revelation. This is empirical observation preserved across generations. Civilizations rise, achieve greatness, fall into corruption or make fatal mistakes, collapse catastrophically, and eventually rebuild to repeat the cycle. Each iteration learns from the previous one, or fails to learn and repeats the same mistakes. The flood myths function as the preserved lesson from the last cycle, the warning passed down to ensure descendants understand that what happened before can happen again. That advancement doesn't guarantee survival. That knowledge without wisdom leads to catastrophe. That pride precedes the fall not as moral judgment but as observable pattern. They warned us. Every culture, every tradition, every mythology that survived long enough to be recorded, they all preserved the same essential warning. They knew this because they'd seen it happen before, or inherited memory from those who witnessed it. The question is whether we're wise enough to recognize the warning, humble enough to acknowledge we might be repeating the pattern, and capable enough to make different choices before the cycle completes again. The myths suggest the answer isn't predetermined. We have agency, we have choice. But we also have the same human nature that led previous civilizations to destruction. And the water, the myths whisper, is always ready to rise again. The earth keeps records more reliable than any library. Layers of sediment, cores of ice, strata of rock. These preserve evidence that doesn't fade with time, doesn't get reinterpreted by successive generations, doesn't get burned when libraries fall or empires collapse. And when you examine these geological archives carefully, what you find supports the catastrophic accounts preserved in myth with remarkable precision. Meltwater Pulse 1A occurred approximately 14,000 years ago. This wasn't gradual sea level rise measured in millimeters per year. This was catastrophic release of glacial melt, raising global sea levels by 16 to 25 meters in less than 500 years. To put that in perspective, imagine standing on a coastline and watching the ocean advance inland by dozens of feet within a single human lifetime. Coastal settlements would have had years, perhaps decades, to relocate as their territories disappeared beneath advancing waters. River valleys would transform into estuaries, islands would vanish, entire geographical regions would be reshaped beyond recognition. Meltwater Pulse 1B came later, around 11,000 years ago, coinciding with the end of the Younger Dryas period. Another episode of rapid sea level rise, another period when humanity's relationship with coastlines would have been violently disrupted. And these weren't isolated events. Ice cores and sediment records show that sea level rise during deglaciation wasn't smooth or gradual, but episodic, marked by sudden jumps when ice dams failed and enormous glacial lakes released their contents catastrophically. The channeled scablands in Washington state preserve evidence of one such catastrophe. Massive channels carved through solid basalt by floods of unimaginable scale. Water moving with such force that it scoured away hundreds of feet of rock, leaving behind landscapes that look more like alien planets than terrestrial geography. These weren't normal river erosion working over millennia. These were catastrophic outburst floods when glacial Lake Missoula's ice dam failed, releasing more water than all the Great Lakes combined in a matter of days. The Black Sea flood hypothesis suggests the Mediterranean breached into the Black Sea basin around 7,500 years ago, transforming a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea within months or years. Coastal settlements around the former lake would have had no warning before the waters came. Some researchers see this event as the basis for regional flood myths, the catastrophe that survivors would remember and retell until memory became mythology. The Younger Dryas boundary layer appears in geological records worldwide, a distinct stratum containing evidence of sudden, violent environmental change. The platinum anomaly we discussed earlier, concentrations far above background levels suggesting extraterrestrial material distributed globally. Nanodiamonds that form only under extreme heat and pressure. Magnetic spherules consistent with impact events. A layer of carbon and soot indicating continental-scale wildfires burning simultaneously across vast distances. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve atmospheric history in annual layers going back over 100,000 years. What they reveal about the Younger Dryas period is startling. Temperature proxies show the cold snap beginning abruptly around 12,800 years ago, with temperatures in some regions dropping as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a single decade. Not gradual cooling, but sudden climate collapse. Then, around 11,600 years ago, equally sudden warming, the Younger Dryas ending as abruptly as it began. Isotopic signatures in these ice cores show unusual compositions during this period. Patterns some researchers interpret as evidence of solar bombardment or atmospheric disruption from impact events. The chemistry doesn't match normal climate variation. Something extraordinary was affecting Earth's atmosphere, something that left traces in the frozen record of ancient air. This is what makes the geological evidence so compelling. It's not dependent on interpretation of myths or archaeological context. It's physical, measurable, testable. The rocks remember sudden violence. The ice preserves atmospheric trauma. The sediments contain evidence of fires and floods and temperature swings that would have made survival nearly impossible across vast regions. And the timeframes align almost perfectly with the mythological accounts. The catastrophic flooding, described in legends worldwide, corresponds to periods of rapid sea level rise preserved in coastal sediments. The destruction by fire, mentioned in numerous traditions, coincides with evidence of massive wildfires in the geological record. The sudden climate change remembered in cultural narratives matches the temperature swings documented in ice cores. Either this is extraordinary coincidence, ancient peoples independently inventing myths that happen to correspond with actual geological events they had no way of knowing about, or the myths preserve genuine historical memory. The stories describe real catastrophes, because real catastrophes happened. Events so traumatic that survivors passed down accounts through generations until they became the foundational narratives of cultures worldwide. The rocks remember what we forgot, and what they remember validates what the myths have been trying to tell us all along. Death leaves evidence. When species vanish, when populations crash, when ecosystems collapse, the physical record preserves what happened, even when memory doesn't. And the paleontological evidence from approximately 12,000 years ago tells a story of extinction on a scale that demands explanation beyond the gradual processes we typically associate with evolutionary change. The Quaternary extinction event eliminated over 100 genera of large mammals between 15,000 and 11,000 years ago. In North America alone, the losses were staggering. Woolly mammoths that had survived multiple previous climate fluctuations vanished. Mastodons disappeared. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant ground sloths, American lions, American camels, enormous beavers the size of bears, short-faced bears, larger than modern grizzlies, all gone within what appears geologically to be an instant. The pattern repeated globally. Australia lost its giant marsupials. South America saw the extinction of enormous ground sloths, giant armadillos, native horses and camels, predators and prey alike, vanishing in synchrony. Eurasia experienced similar losses. Species that had endured for millions of years, that had adapted to previous climate changes, that had coexisted with human hunters for thousands of years, suddenly reached simultaneous endpoints. The conventional explanation points to human overhunting, the overkill hypothesis suggesting that newly arrived human populations hunted megafauna to extinction. But this explanation faces significant problems. African megafauna coexisted with humans for hundreds of thousands of years without suffering similar extinctions. The hunting pressure required to drive these species to extinction, given sparse human populations and primitive hunting technology, seems unrealistically high. And the timing of extinctions coincides more closely with climate catastrophe than with human arrival in various regions. The alternative interpretation sees these extinctions as environmental rather than anthropogenic. Rapid climate change transforming ecosystems faster than large animals could adapt. Habitat loss as ice age conditions gave way to warmer, different landscapes. And potentially catastrophic events, impacts, fires, floods, creating cascades of environmental stress that pushed species already struggling with changing conditions past their survival thresholds. Extinction patterns support this environmental interpretation. Larger animals died out more readily than smaller ones, consistent with rapid change, favoring species with faster reproduction and greater adaptability. Island populations survived longer than mainland ones, suggesting continental catastrophes were more severe than isolated disasters. Certain regions showed more dramatic losses, possibly indicating impact zones or areas experiencing the most severe climate disruption. The evidence from preserved specimens is particularly striking. Mammoths found frozen in Siberian permafrost, with undigested vegetation still in their stomachs and mouths, as if death came so suddenly they didn't finish swallowing their last meal. The flowers and grasses preserved with them indicate they died during summer or early fall, not during winter when freezing might be expected. Something caught them completely by surprise, freezing them so rapidly that decomposition never began. Mass bone deposits appear at various sites worldwide, accumulations of remains suggesting catastrophic mortality events rather than gradual die-offs over extended periods. Some deposits show evidence of burning. Others show trauma consistent with violent death. The concentrations and conditions don't match patterns you'd expect from hunting or normal predation or disease. They suggest sudden, simultaneous death affecting entire populations. What survived reveals as much as what died. Smaller mammals made it through. Most bird species persisted. Marine life continued, though with some extinctions among coastal species. Certain large animals survived in isolated refugia, protected by geography from whatever was affecting their mainland relatives. The survival pattern suggests that size, location, and adaptability determined outcomes more than any single factor. Humans experienced their own bottleneck during this period. Genetic analysis indicates global human populations may have crashed to fewer than 10,000 individuals, creating a genetic choke point from which all modern humans descend. We survived, but barely. The diversity we see in modern human populations developed entirely after this bottleneck, meaning that whatever caused it was severe enough to bring our species to the edge of extinction alongside the megafauna we shared the world with. The mammoths died with flowers in their mouths. The ground sloths perished before reaching their burrows. The saber-toothed cats made no last stands. They simply ended, their remains preserved in layers of earth that mark the boundary between the world that was and the world that followed. Not gradual decline, but sudden catastrophe. Not evolutionary inevitability, but environmental trauma on a scale that transformed the planet's ecology within a geological instant. The bones remember. And what they remember isn't extinction through normal processes, but death through catastrophe that spared no species, no region, no ecosystem from its violence. Human artifacts tell stories stone and bone cannot. Tools change, settlements shift. Cultures rise and vanish, leaving traces that archaeologists piece together to reconstruct what happened when memory fails and myths become the only record. And around 12,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows disruptions that parallel the geological and paleontological evidence of catastrophe. The Clovis culture dominated North America approximately 13,500 years ago. These weren't primitive hunter-gatherers barely surviving. They were sophisticated people with advanced stone tool technology, the distinctive Clovis points found from Alaska to Central America, showing remarkable consistency in design and execution. They thrived across the continent, adapting to diverse environments, successfully hunting megafauna, establishing themselves as the dominant human presence in a vast territory. Then, around 12,800 years ago, they disappeared. Not gradually, not through visible conquest or assimilation. Sites showing continuous Clovis occupation simply stop. The technology vanishes from the archaeological record. What follows is a period of apparent disruption. Different and less sophisticated stone tool traditions, emerging as if populations had been scattered, knowledge lost, cultural continuity broken. The coincidence with the Younger Dryas impact event is exact. Whatever happened to the climate and the megafauna happened to the Clovis culture as well. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey presents a different mystery. This massive complex of carved stone monuments was deliberately buried around 10,000 years ago. The builders didn't abandon it to decay naturally. They carefully filled in the structures, covering them with earth, as if preserving them for future discovery or hiding them from something they feared. Why would people who invested enormous resources creating this site deliberately entomb their own work? Were they fleeing some threat? Protecting sacred knowledge from less advanced populations? Preserving evidence of their capabilities for descendants who might someday understand? The Natufian culture in the Levant shows evidence of early experimentation with agriculture and permanent settlement beginning around 13,000 years ago, then experiencing disruption during the Younger Dryas before agriculture fully developed in the subsequent Neolithic period. It's as if they were on the verge of a transition to farming when catastrophe interrupted the process, forcing a temporary return to more mobile, less complex subsistence strategies before stability allowed resumption of agricultural development. Settlement patterns worldwide show a notable feature. Most archaeological sites from before 10,000 years ago are inland or at higher elevations. Coastal sites from this period are extremely rare, not because ancient peoples avoided coasts, but because coastal settlements from the Ice Age now rest beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water. The absence isn't evidence that coastal civilizations didn't exist. It's evidence that sea level rise inundated them, leaving only highland sites accessible to archaeological investigation. This creates a fundamental bias in our understanding of pre-flood populations. We find what survived above the waterline. We don't find what drowned. If the most advanced pre-flood civilizations were coastal, as logic suggests, since coasts offer resources, trade routes, and moderate climates, then the archaeological record preferentially preserves evidence of less advanced inland populations, while the sophisticated coastal societies remain submerged and undiscovered. Agriculture's sudden appearance after the Younger Dryas presents another puzzle. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans hunted and gathered. Then, within just a few thousand years, farming emerged independently in the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. Either this represents extraordinary coincidence, or it represents simultaneous rediscovery of techniques that were known before the catastrophe, lost during the climate chaos, and then independently recovered as conditions stabilized. The sophistication of early agriculture supports the rediscovery interpretation. The earliest farming communities show surprising understanding of selective breeding, irrigation management, and crop rotation knowledge that typically requires generations of experimentation to develop. It's as if they were working from existing understanding, rather than discovering everything through trial and error. Artifact distributions show another telling pattern. Advanced tools and artistic objects from before 12,000 years ago demonstrate sophistication comparable to much later periods. Then apparent simplification during the Younger Dryas, then gradual elaboration afterward. Not steady linear progress, but a pattern consistent with knowledge loss followed by slow recovery. They buried their temple and walked away. The Clovis culture vanished without clear explanation. Coastal settlements drowned beneath rising seas. Agriculture appeared suddenly after the catastrophe ended. The archaeological record doesn't show smooth cultural evolution. It shows disruption, loss, and recovery. It shows catastrophe preserved, not in myth, but in the material remains of peoples whose world ended and whose survivors had to rebuild from whatever fragments they could preserve through the chaos that destroyed everything they'd known. The archaeologists have a point. They really do. When you claim that advanced civilizations existed before recorded history, when you suggest that sophisticated societies thrived and then vanished, leaving barely a trace, the burden of proof is on you to show the evidence. And the mainstream response to theories about pre-flood civilizations is worth taking seriously because it comes from people who've spent careers studying ancient cultures, excavating sites, analyzing artifacts, and building comprehensive understanding of how human societies developed. The standard archaeological narrative is this: human civilization developed gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. Simple hunter-gatherer bands slowly became more complex. Agriculture emerged around 10,000 years ago in several regions. Permanent settlements followed. Then cities, writing, metallurgy, organized states, all developing in logical sequence beginning roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. This narrative is supported by vast quantities of archaeological evidence from thousands of sites worldwide. It follows developmental progression that makes intuitive sense. It doesn't require invoking lost knowledge or vanished civilizations. The objections to alternative theories are specific and legitimate. Where are the definitive artifacts? If advanced pre-flood civilizations existed, they would have produced tools, machines, technological debris, the material culture that any sophisticated society generates. Advanced metallurgy leaves slag heaps, construction leaves quarries, manufacturing leaves waste, cities leave infrastructure, roads, sewage systems, foundations that survive millennia. Yet we don't find these things in contexts older than conventional timelines suggest they should exist. The problem of scale compounds the difficulty. If these civilizations were widespread and advanced, covering significant territories with substantial populations, the statistical likelihood of finding evidence increases dramatically. We've conducted archaeological surveys across most of the globe. We've excavated thousands of sites. We've analyzed sediment cores, excavated caves, explored deserts and jungles and mountain ranges. Why hasn't this extensive investigation produced more definitive evidence of pre-flood sophistication? And 12,000 years isn't that long ago geologically. Yes, sea levels rose and coastlines changed. Yes, climate shifted and landscapes transformed. But stone doesn't vanish. Metal corrodes but leaves traces. Pottery breaks but shards persist for tens of thousands of years. The evidence should be there if the civilizations were. The absence requires explanation beyond simply claiming everything was lost. Mainstream archaeology offers prosaic explanations for the anomalies we've discussed. Ancient structures like the pyramids and megalithic monuments can be explained through known primitive technologies applied with sufficient labor and time. Give people enough workers, enough years, and simple tools like copper chisels and wooden rollers, and remarkable things become possible. The astronomical knowledge, encoded in ancient architecture, results from centuries of careful observation, not inherited wisdom from vanished predecessors. The flood myths are natural, given that humans preferentially settled near water and experienced regular flooding, rivers overflow, coastlines erode, tsunamis strike, and communities naturally develop stories about catastrophic inundation. The Younger Dryas period did involve climate change and megafauna extinction, but these can be explained through conventional mechanisms. Gradual ice melt with occasional rapid pulses, human overhunting of megafauna populations, natural climate variability. No need to invoke catastrophic impacts or lost civilizations to explain what standard geological and ecological processes can account for adequately. There are legitimate concerns about alternative archaeology that deserve acknowledgement. The tendency exists to cherry-pick evidence that supports preferred conclusions while ignoring data that doesn't fit. Confirmation bias affects interpretation of ambiguous findings. Commercial incentives favor sensationalizing mysteries over acknowledging when prosaic explanations are more likely. Mainstream archaeology has been correct to be skeptical of many fringe claims and has exposed numerous hoaxes and misinterpretations over the years. The scientific method requires skepticism, demands rigorous evidence, insists on reproducible results. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the burden of proof rests with those making claims that contradict established understanding. This isn't dogmatism. This isn't institutional resistance to new ideas. This is the basic intellectual framework that has proven effective in building reliable knowledge about the world. So the challenge stands. Show us the cities. Show us the machines. Show us the proof that can't be explained away through conventional mechanisms. Show us evidence that would convince skeptics, rather than just reinforcing beliefs of those already inclined to accept alternative narratives. The archaeologists aren't being unreasonable in demanding this. They're being scientists, and their objections deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal. But here is what the skeptics might be missing. The most likely locations of pre-flood coastal civilizations are now underwater, not shallow water where diving is easy. Deep water, hundreds of feet down in some cases, where systematic archaeological investigation requires expensive equipment, specialized training, and funding that is difficult to secure when mainstream archaeology doesn't consider the search worthwhile. We've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. The continental shelves that were exposed during the Ice Age, where logic suggests coastal populations would have concentrated, remain largely unexamined by archaeologists. The underwater discoveries we have made challenge conventional timeline. The Yonaguni monument off Japan shows massive stone structures with right-angle cuts, apparent terracing, and architectural features at depths, requiring they were constructed when sea levels were far lower, at least 10,000 years ago and possibly much earlier. Mainstream archaeology dismisses it as natural formation, but geologists who examined it note features inconsistent with natural erosion patterns. Off Dwarka in India, sonar has mapped what appear to be walls, foundations, and structured settlements beneath 100 feet of water. Near Cuba, researchers have documented geometric patterns on the ocean floor at depth of 2,000 feet, formations that would have to be impossibly ancient if artificial, but which show regularity that natural processes struggle to explain. The Mediterranean contains extensive submerged settlements that predate classical civilizations, structures that were above water more recently than Ice Age formations, but which still suggest sophisticated classical societies whose existence is accounted for in standard historical narratives. These aren't definitive proof of advanced pre-flood civilizations, but they re-tantalizing hints that we are missing significant portions of the archaeological record simply because we are not looking in the right places. The objection about missing artifacts assumes that advanced civilizations must produce the kind of technological debris industrial societies generate. But what if pre-flood advancement was different in character? What if their sophistication lay in astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, and architecture rather than in metallurgy and machinery? Knowledge-based advancement would necessarily leave extensive physical remains, organic materials decay, wood rots, textiles disintegrate, even stone structures collapse into formations that resemble natural geology after sufficient time and weathering. 12,000 years is actually quite long for preservation, when you account for catastrophic flooding, scouring away surface structures, for subsequent civilizations building atop earlier ruins and destroying or obscuring them in the process, and for archaeological preservation being biased toward dry, stable environments rather than former coastal zones, subjected to rising seas, erosion, and sediment deposition. The absence of evidence in explored locations doesn't necessarily mean evidence doesn't exist. It might mean we re-looking in the wrong places, or that the evidence we've found hasn't been recognized for what it is. Demonstration projects attempting to replicate ancient megalithic construction using proposed primitive methods have largely failed to achieve the precision and scale of the originals. Modern stonemasons with traditional tools struggle to match the tolerances found in ancient work. Transportation of multi-ton stones remains unexplained, despite various hypotheses about rollers, sleds, and massive labor forces, and the sudden appearance of sophisticated technique without apparent developmental progression. No practice pieces, no progressive improvement, just immediate mastery, suggests inherited knowledge rather than independent invention. The flood myths deserve more serious consideration than mainstream archaeology typically grants them. Over 200 cultures preserving remarkably consistent accounts of catastrophic flooding, divine warning, survival on boats, landing on mountains, and preservation of knowledge or species. The global distribution and specific consistencies suggest common origin in actual catastrophic events rather than independent invention. Dismissing hundreds of cultural traditions as mere mythological coincidence shows cultural bias, favoring written historical records over oral traditions that might preserve genuine historical memory. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has gained increasing mainstream scientific support as evidence accumulates, publications in peer-reviewed journals, conferences dedicated to examining the evidence, researchers from multiple disciplines finding data consistent with the impact scenario. This isn't fringe speculation anymore. It is legitimate scientific debate about catastrophic events that coincide with the time frame ancient myths describe. If their cities sleep under miles of ocean and their knowledge dissolved with time, maybe we shouldn't be surprised by absence of evidence in the limited locations we thoroughly explored. Maybe the absence isn't evidence of absence after all. Maybe it is evidence that we need to look harder, dig deeper, and explore the submerged continental shelves, where the real story of pre-flood humanity might be waiting. The truth, as it often does, probably lies somewhere between the extremes, not in the most conservative mainstream position that dismisses all alternative theories, but also not in the most speculative claims about pre-flood civilizations possessing technology, rivaling or exceeding our own. The middle ground is uncomfortable because it requires holding uncertainty, acknowledging limitations, accepting that some questions don't have definitive answers yet. But uncomfortable middle ground is where genuine inquiry lives. Start with what both sides generally accept. Sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age, inundating vast coastal territories. The Younger Dryas period represented sudden and dramatic climate change. Megafauna extinctions occurred relatively rapidly around 12,000 years ago. Early civilizations appeared with surprisingly sophisticated capabilities in multiple regions within a few thousand years. Flood myths are genuinely widespread across global cultures. These are established facts, not matters of significant dispute. The uncertainties begin when we ask about mechanisms and interpretations. What exactly triggered the Younger Dryas climate disruption? Impact hypothesis versus other mechanisms remains debated, even among scientists sympathetic to catastrophic explanations. What caused megafauna extinctions? Human hunting contributed, but how much versus environmental change remains uncertain. How much cultural continuity versus independent innovation characterized early agricultural civilizations? Evidence exists for both, and the mixture varies by region. Archaeological uncertainties are substantial. How much evidence has been lost to rising seas, erosion, and subsequent construction? We can know without exploring locations we haven't investigated yet. Does current absence of evidence from submerged continental shelves represent genuine absence of advanced settlements or merely insufficient exploration? The question answers itself. We haven't looked thoroughly enough to know. Do sophisticated early structures represent inherited knowledge, independent innovation, or some combination? Probably all three, depending on specific cases. But disentangling these is difficult with available evidence. The spectrum of reasonable positions is wider than either mainstream or alternative advocates typically acknowledge. Conservative views that allow for some knowledge loss during Younger Dryas disruption but maintain conventional development timelines. Moderate alternative views that propose significantly advanced pre-flood societies whose knowledge was partially preserved and contributed to early post-flood civilizations. More speculative positions about highly advanced ancient capabilities that remain unproven, but not entirely implausible given gaps in our knowledge. What current evidence probably doesn't support is the most extreme version of alternative claims, pre-flood civilizations with electronics, aircraft, energy systems comparable to industrial modernity. The absence of any artifacts consistent with such technology, even in underwater contexts we have explored, makes these scenarios unlikely. But mainstream archaeology may well underestimate the sophistication and extent of pre-flood human societies. The assumption that hunter-gatherers could achieve astronomical knowledge, could develop sophisticated mathematics, could organize to build monumental architecture. These assumptions have been challenged repeatedly by actual discoveries. Perhaps human history involves cycles rather than purely linear progress. Knowledge can be lost and partially recovered. Civilizations can be advanced in some domains while primitive in others. Catastrophic events can indeed erase large portions of the archaeological record, especially when those events specifically target coastal regions where populations and resources naturally concentrate. None of this is impossible. None of it violates physical laws or requires magical thinking. It just requires acknowledging that our understanding is incomplete. Future research might resolve current uncertainties. Systematic underwater archaeological surveys of submerged continental shelves using modern remote sensing technology. Improved dating techniques that can establish more precise chronologies for ancient structures. Genetic analysis revealing population movements, bottlenecks, and connections between distant populations. Interdisciplinary approaches combining archaeology, geology, genetics, and climatology to build comprehensive pictures rather than disciplinary fragments. Until then, intellectual humility serves better than certainty. Acknowledge the limitations of current evidence. Recognize that absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence, especially when we've explored such a small fraction of potentially relevant locations. Accept that some questions don't have definitive answers yet. Remain open to future discoveries that might significantly revise our understanding, while also demanding rigorous evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. The truth probably lies buried where neither side wants to dig in the uncomfortable middle, where certainty dissolves and genuine mystery begins. Where we acknowledge both that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and that our current evidence base has significant gaps. Where we recognize that ancient peoples were more sophisticated than often credited, while also accepting that definitive proof of advanced pre-flood civilizations remains elusive. Where we remain curious without being credulous, skeptical without being dismissive, and humble enough to acknowledge how much we don't know about our own deep past. Understanding the past changes how we see the present. If civilizations can rise to remarkable heights and then collapse so completely that their existence becomes disputed mythology, what does that mean for us? We've achieved technological capabilities that would seem godlike to our ancestors from just a few generations ago. We've split atoms, mapped genomes, created artificial intelligence, sent machines to other planets. And yet we've also created vulnerabilities that could end everything we've built faster than the catastrophes that supposedly destroyed pre-flood civilizations. The parallels are uncomfortable. Just as ancient societies might have possessed sophisticated astronomical, mathematical, and architectural knowledge while remaining vulnerable to environmental catastrophe, we've mastered technologies that let us live in deserts and frozen wastelands, that cure diseases that once killed millions, that connect billions of people instantly across continents. But these same capabilities have created fragility our ancestors never faced. Modern civilization rests on systems of breathtaking complexity and equally breathtaking vulnerability. Electrical grids that could be crippled by solar storms or electromagnetic pulses, leaving entire continents without power for months or years. Global food systems dependent on stable climate, intact logistics, and continuous function of refrigeration and transportation networks. Economic systems requiring uninterrupted operation of banking and communication infrastructure, vulnerable to cyber attacks or technological failures. Knowledge repositories increasingly digital, concentrated in formats that require specific technology to access, vulnerable to corruption or deletion in ways physical libraries never were. History shows how quickly sophisticated knowledge can be lost. When the Roman Empire fell, the recipe for their concrete, which still outlasts modern formulations, was forgotten. Aqueduct construction, road engineering, administrative techniques all declined or disappeared. The Bronze Age collapse erased writing systems that weren't recovered for centuries. The burning of libraries destroyed texts that existed in no other copies, knowledge that could never be recreated because the contexts that produced it were gone. Specialist craftspeople died taking techniques to the grave because apprenticeship systems broke down during periods of disruption. The paradox is that advancement creates both resilience and vulnerability simultaneously. We can survive conditions that would have killed our ancestors. Climate control, modern medicine, engineered food production, these let us inhabit environments that would otherwise be lethal. But we've also created concentrated points of failure, nuclear facilities that require continuous monitoring and maintenance. bioweapons laboratories containing pathogens that could cause pandemics if accidentally released, artificial intelligence systems whose malfunction or misuse could have cascading consequences we can barely imagine. The knowledge problem compounds everything. How much of what we know exists only in distributed, specialized form? No individual understands our complete technological infrastructure. The supply chains that produce smartphones involve thousands of steps across dozens of countries. The computer systems managing power grids, financial networks, and military arsenals are so complex that even their designers don't fully comprehend all their interactions. If specialists died or communication failed, if infrastructure collapsed and we needed to rebuild, could we? Do enough people understand fundamental processes, metallurgy, agriculture, medicine, construction, to recreate civilization from scratch? Ironically, the knowledge that would be most valuable in recovering from catastrophe isn't advanced theoretical physics or computer science. It's practical capabilities. How to grow food without industrial agriculture, how to forge metal without electric furnaces, how to treat disease without modern pharmaceuticals, how to build shelter without power tools. The same foundational technologies that both modern and potentially pre-flood civilizations had to master, because these are the capabilities that enable everything else. Studying potential pre-flood catastrophes might teach us about knowledge preservation, the value of distributed rather than centralized repositories, so destruction of one location doesn't mean total loss. The importance of oral transmission and apprenticeship alongside written records, because direct experience transmits understanding that text alone cannot. The need for knowledge to be practically applicable rather than purely theoretical, because abstract understanding without ability to implement it is useless during recovery. The wisdom of maintaining low-technology backup systems for critical functions, because high-technology solutions fail catastrophically when their supporting infrastructure collapses. We're more advanced than they were and just as vulnerable. Maybe more vulnerable because we've optimized everything for efficiency, and efficiency creates brittleness. The question isn't whether catastrophe will come. Catastrophes always come eventually. The question is whether we'll be wiser when we rebuild, whether we're preparing not just to prevent disaster, but to survive it if prevention fails. The specific threats we face today would be recognizable to anyone studying what might have destroyed pre-flood civilizations. The mechanisms differ, but the patterns remain disturbingly similar. Knowledge outpacing wisdom, capabilities advancing faster than our ability to manage them responsibly. Systems becoming so complex and interconnected that their failure modes become catastrophic rather than merely problematic. Climate disruption presents the most obvious parallel. Just as rapid climate change during the Younger Dryas potentially devastated societies adapted to stable conditions, we've rebuilt modern civilization optimized for the relatively stable Holocene climate of the past 10,000 years. Our agriculture depends on predictable rainfall patterns. Our cities occupy coastal zones vulnerable to sea level rise. Our water supplies rely on seasonal snowmelt and aquifer recharge that changing weather patterns disrupt. Even moderate climate shifts could trigger agricultural failures, force mass migration, destabilize political systems already strained by resource competition. The nuclear threat embodies the pattern ancient myths describe: knowledge that brings both unprecedented power and existential danger. We split the atom and gained energy abundance, alongside the capability to destroy civilization within hours. The technology is morally neutral. Whether it builds or destroys depends entirely on human choices, human wisdom, human restraint. And these must hold perfectly forever, because one mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of madness could end everything. Flood myths warn of civilizations that possessed great knowledge, but used it destructively. We have nuclear weapons. The parallel needs no elaboration. Pandemic threats have moved from theoretical to visceral given recent experience. Modern civilization, interconnectedness, means diseases spread globally within days. Laboratory work on dangerous pathogens, conducted with the best intentions to develop treatments and vaccines, creates risks of accidental or deliberate release. And pandemic response requires coordinated global action that political divisions make difficult. Perhaps pre-flood civilizations faced similar challenges: knowledge of dangerous processes, inability to cooperate in face of existential threat. the same human nature that makes collective action difficult, even when survival depends on it. Unlike pre-flood civilizations who could only witness and endure cosmic catastrophes, we possess technology to detect and potentially deflect dangerous asteroids. This capability is recent and not comprehensively deployed. We might survive what destroyed our predecessors, or we might suffer the same fate if we fail to take the threat seriously, if we don't invest sufficiently in detection systems and deflection capabilities, if we assume that because impacts are rare we need not prepare for them. Technological risks proliferate faster than our wisdom in managing them. Artificial intelligence advancing toward or beyond human level capability with unclear methods for ensuring it remains under human control or shares human values. Genetic engineering, enabling modifications to organisms and ecosystems with consequences we can fully predict. Nanotechnology potentially creating self-replicating systems that could malfunction catastrophically. The pattern repeats, capabilities developing faster than wisdom to deploy them safely. Precisely what myths suggest destroyed pre-flood civilizations. Information collapse presents a modern version of ancient libraries burning. Our knowledge exists increasingly in fragile digital formats, vulnerable to electromagnetic pulses, to degradation of storage media, to obsolescence of the systems required to access it. The internet concentrates information access while making deep knowledge rarer. Everyone can search for facts, but fewer people develop genuine expertise. Artificial intelligence threatens to replace human understanding before we've ensured that knowledge can be preserved and transmitted. If the systems fail, vast knowledge could be lost instantly. Just as the Library of Alexandria burned, just as Mayan codices were destroyed, just as countless repositories of learning have vanished through history. Geopolitical fragility mirrors the inability to cooperate that myths often cite as contributing to pre-flood catastrophes. Nuclear-armed nations competing for resources and influence, where miscalculation or escalation could trigger exchanges that end civilization. Resource scarcity, water, rare minerals, arable land, creating conflicts that political systems struggle to resolve peacefully. Polarization making coordinated response to shared threats nearly impossible even when survival might depend on cooperation. We've built weapons that could split the world, systems that could starve billions, intelligence that might replace or surpass us. The myths say their civilization fell because they went too far, because they possessed knowledge they couldn't manage wisely, because they created capabilities without corresponding ethics to guide their use. How far is too far for us? Have we already crossed whatever threshold they crossed? Or do we still have time to choose differently? Awareness changes nothing if it doesn't lead to action. Understanding that civilizations can collapse, that knowledge can be lost, that catastrophes can erase centuries of progress. This understanding is worthless unless it informs how we prepare for potential futures, how we build resilience into fragile systems, how we preserve what matters most against the disasters we can't prevent. Knowledge preservation requires both technological and practical approaches. Maintain physical libraries alongside digital repositories, because books survive electromagnetic pulses and don't require electricity to access. Teach practical skills rather than purely abstract knowledge, because understanding principles matters less than ability to apply them when infrastructure fails. Develop distributed knowledge systems that don't rely on centralized infrastructure, because losing one location shouldn't mean losing everything it contained. Preserve low-technology solutions alongside high-technology capabilities, because the sophisticated systems we prefer might not be available during recovery periods. Institutions have begun addressing these concerns. The Global Seed Vault in Svalbard preserves crop diversity against agricultural catastrophes, maintaining genetic material that could rebuild farming after disasters. The Long Now Foundation works to create knowledge repositories designed to remain accessible across vast timescales. Projects exist to develop resilient communication systems that could survive infrastructure collapse. Some organizations maintain manufacturing capabilities for basic technologies, even as industrial processes become more specialized and concentrated, recognizing that distributed manufacturing capacity provides resilience against disruption. Community-level resilience might matter more than institutional preparation. Local food production capacity means communities aren't entirely dependent on global supply chains vulnerable to disruption. Knowledge sharing and skill development within communities creates redundancy, where any member's death doesn't erase unique expertise. Networks of mutual support that function without external infrastructure, provide alternatives when centralized systems fail. Traditions of practical craftsmanship that don't require industrial supply chains preserve capabilities that would otherwise be lost as manufacturing concentrates in distant facilities. Individual preparation doesn't require paranoia or extremism. Learn practical skills because they're valuable regardless of whether catastrophe comes: gardening, food preservation, basic medicine, tool use. Understand fundamental technologies well enough to maintain or rebuild them. Develop self-sufficiency in critical areas while maintaining community connections, because isolation is vulnerability, but total dependence is equally dangerous. Cultivate psychological resilience to face uncertainty and potential hardship, because mental preparation might matter as much as physical stockpiles. But preparation alone isn't enough. Wisdom matters more than knowledge, ethics more than capabilities. Make choices about technology deployment that consider long-term consequences alongside short-term benefits. Develop decision-making systems that account for existential risks rather than optimizing only for efficiency or profit. Cultivate humility to recognize our limitations, to acknowledge that we don't fully understand the systems we've created, to accept that some capabilities might not be worth pursuing, even if they're possible. Perhaps this wisdom, more than any specific preparation, is what pre-flood civilizations lacked. Studying history and prehistory, real or mythical, provides perspective that contemporary concerns often lack. Understanding that collapse is possible helps motivate prevention. Recognizing patterns in civilizational cycles informs better choices about which paths to pursue and which to avoid. Learning from past failures, whether they actually happened or exist only as cautionary tales, provides guidance that could help us navigate challenges our ancestors faced without the benefit of their warnings. Balance preparation with hope. Take reasonable precautions without descending into paranoid isolation. Work to reduce civilizational risks while building personal resilience. Maintain purpose and meaning even while acknowledging genuine threats, because despair serves no one and nihilism guarantees the worst outcomes. Perhaps awareness itself provides protection. Maybe pre-flood civilizations collapsed partly from not recognizing their vulnerability, from not imagining their knowledge could be lost, from not preparing for catastrophes they assumed couldn't happen to them. We have the advantage of historical perspective, mythical warnings, scientific understanding of threats. We know civilizations can fall. We know knowledge can be lost. We know catastrophes can happen because they've happened before. The real lesson isn't that catastrophe is inevitable. It's that preparation and wisdom can change outcomes, that we get to choose how our chapter of the human story ends. We might choose wisely. We might choose poorly. But unlike pre-flood civilizations who perhaps didn't recognize the patterns until too late, we have the warnings. Whether we heed them remains to be seen. Imagine waking to a world that doesn't exist anymore. The stars you see through the window aren't quite the same stars we see now. Precession has shifted them slightly in 13,000 years. The air smells different, tastes different, carries scents of vegetation that went extinct before the pyramids were built. The sound of waves comes from a coastline that now rests beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. And the birds calling in the pre-dawn darkness belong to species whose names we'll never know because they vanished with the world that sustained them. The dwelling you wake in might not be the primitive hut we imagine when we think of ancient peoples. Perhaps it's a well-constructed structure with stone foundation fitted precisely without mortar, timbers joined using knowledge of load distribution and structural integrity, a design that incorporates astronomical alignments, so specific angles of sunlight mark seasonal changes. The floor might be paved, the walls plastered, the roof designed to channel rainwater into storage vessels. Not because you're wealthy or exceptional, but because this is simply how things are built, how they've been built for as long as anyone can remember. You rise before dawn, because work begins with first light. The fire from last night has been banked carefully, coals still glowing beneath ash, and it takes only moments to coax flames back to life, using techniques passed down through so many generations that no one remembers their origin. The fuel isn't just gathered wood, but precisely selected materials, certain woods for cooking that impart no unpleasant flavors, others for heating that burn long and steady, still others for specific crafts requiring particular temperatures. Breakfast might include grains we no longer cultivate, ground using stones shaped to exact specifications, prepared in ways that maximize nutrition and preserve surplus for seasons when fresh food is scarce. Perhaps there's fish caught in waters now 200 feet above where fishermen currently work, or fruit from trees that will disappear when the climate shifts and their specific ecological requirements no longer exist anywhere on Earth. The meal is simple but not crude, prepared with knowledge of nutrition and preservation that won't be fully understood again for thousands of years. The community around you numbers in the thousands perhaps, a settlement large enough to support specialized work. Not everyone hunts or farms. Some focus on astronomical observation, tracking celestial patterns through years of patient recording, developing mathematical models to predict seasons and eclipses. Others direct architectural projects, applying geometric principles to create structures that will outlast civilizations if they survive the catastrophe to come. Craftspeople work with tools more sophisticated than stone hammers and wooden digging sticks, using techniques that leave no archaeological trace because the materials decay or the methods seem too advanced to attribute to this period. The day's work might involve agricultural management irrigation systems, requiring understanding of water flow and soil drainage, crop rotation, preserving soil fertility, selective breeding, gradually improving yields, or maritime activities, fishing using knowledge of seasonal migrations and current patterns, possibly trade with other coastal settlements, exchanging goods and information across networks spanning hundreds of miles. The relationship with the ocean is intimate because the coast provides abundance, supports population density, enables the complexity that makes civilization possible. Around you, megafauna that seem fantastical to us are simply neighbors. Mammoths grazing in herds, their seasonal movements as predictable as modern migrations. Giant ground sloths moving with deceptive speed when threatened. Saber-toothed cats hunting in packs. These aren't museum reconstructions, but living parts of an ecosystem you navigate daily, some dangerous, some indifferent, all familiar through lifelong experience. As the sun sets and the day's work concludes, perhaps there are gatherings, knowledge shared between specialists, stories told that encode astronomical data and mathematical relationships in narrative form that can be memorized and transmitted, even if writing systems fail. Spiritual practices that might seem like pure religion to archaeologists, but which preserve practical information about agriculture, architecture, and navigation in symbolic language resistant to corruption across generations. You watch stars emerge in a sky unpolluted by artificial light, constellations whose positions you know intimately because they guide planting and harvesting, because they mark time in cycles longer than individual human lives. And you sleep in a world that feels permanent, eternal, as if it will continue forever unchanged. Because that's what every generation believes about their world, right up until the moment it ends.
The signs begin subtly, weather patterns shifting in ways the oldest members of the community don't remember from their grandparents' stories. Animals behaving strangely, migrations beginning early or late, species appearing in territories they normally avoid. The astronomers notice celestial phenomena that shouldn't occur. Objects moving through the sky that don't follow the patterns mapped across generations. Some recognize these as omens. Some understand these are warnings of approaching catastrophe. Most dismiss them because humans are exceptionally talented at normalcy bias, at assuming tomorrow will resemble today, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Then one morning the sky itself changes. Objects appear overhead, bright points of light growing rapidly larger and brighter, moving with impossible speed, trailing fire as atmospheric friction turns air into plasma. For a few seconds or minutes, people stop what they're doing and stare upward, trying to understand what they're witnessing, the human mind struggling to process something unprecedented, something that violates every expectation about how the world works. The impacts begin. Not one massive collision, but multiple strikes scattered across the northern hemisphere. A cosmic shotgun blast of comet fragments hitting ice sheets and oceans, and land in a sequence lasting hours perhaps, each impact releasing energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. The closest ones are heard and felt immediately. Shockwaves traveling faster than sound, arriving as overpressure that flattens structures and forests, that ruptures eardrums and collapses lungs, that turns the familiar landscape into chaos within seconds. Thermal radiation from atmospheric entry and impact ignites fires across continental scales. Forests that have stood for thousands of years burn simultaneously, across distances greater than anyone could travel in a lifetime. The smoke rises into an atmosphere already filling with dust and debris, and within hours, the sky begins darkening as sunlight struggles to penetrate the veil of particulates suspended in the upper atmosphere. For coastal settlements, the nightmare arrives as walls of water. Ocean impacts generate tsunamis that race toward land at hundreds of miles per hour, waves that grow to hundreds of feet as they approach shallow coastal shelves. There is no warning, no time to flee. Cities that took generations to build are obliterated in minutes, populations drowned or crushed by the sheer violence of water, moving with force that pulverizes stone and scours bedrock clean. Those who survive the initial wave face the waters that follow, the inundation that doesn't recede, the realization that the coastline they knew is gone and won't return. Inland populations face different horrors. The sky continues darkening. Temperatures begin dropping as solar radiation is blocked by atmospheric debris. What was summer becomes autumn within days, autumn becomes winter within weeks, and the winter doesn't end. Plants die as photosynthesis becomes impossible. Herbivores starve as vegetation disappears. Predators starve as prey populations collapse. And humans, occupying no specific ecological niche, but depending on ecosystem stability, watch the world they understood transform into something alien and hostile. The choices facing survivors are impossible. Stay in familiar territories hoping conditions will improve, risking starvation as food supplies dwindle. Flee toward regions that might be less affected, abandoning everything, risking death during migration. Preserve knowledge and tools despite their weight, or abandon them to travel light and fast. Communities fracture as different groups make different choices. Some gather in defended positions and ration remaining supplies. Some scatter into small mobile bands. Some simply give up, unable to psychologically process the magnitude of what is happening. Months pass in volcanic winter conditions. The dust begins settling, but temperatures remain low. Megafauna corpses provide temporary food sources as animals die from starvation. But this just delays the inevitable, while eliminating the long-term resources future recovery will require. Trade networks collapse as communication fails, and travel becomes too dangerous. Settlements that depended on exchange and specialization can no longer sustain themselves. Knowledge holders die without transmitting their expertise, because there is no time for teaching when every day is consumed by the struggle to survive. The triage of knowledge is brutal. Astronomical understanding is prioritized, because observing the sky requires no physical resources. Mathematical principles are maintained because they can be transmitted orally. Agricultural knowledge is preserved because it will be essential for rebuilding. But historical records, philosophical traditions, technical specifications for technologies that can't be implemented without infrastructure, these fade because they seem less urgent than immediate survival. The old world dies not just physically but intellectually, remembered in fragments that will eventually become the myths descendants will struggle to believe. The immediate post-catastrophe period is primitive in ways that would shock anyone who knew the pre-flood world. Small groups scattered across landscapes, living in caves or crude shelters, reduced to basic subsistence, despite potentially possessing knowledge of astronomy and mathematics that won't be matched again for millennia. The irony is bitter people who understood celestial mechanics, forced to focus all energy on finding enough food to survive another day, knowledge becoming useless when the infrastructure to apply it is gone. But gradually, incrementally, conditions stabilize. The dust settles over years. Temperatures begin recovering as atmospheric debris clears and solar radiation reaches the surface again. Plants return, first hardy species adapted to disturbed environments, eventually more diverse vegetation as ecosystems rebuild. Animals adapt to new conditions, surviving species filling ecological niches left vacant by extinctions. And survivor groups, isolated during the worst periods, gradually reconnect as travel becomes safer and communication re-establishes. Knowledge transmission becomes critical during this recovery phase. Without writing materials or the stability to maintain libraries, everything depends on oral tradition. Astronomical data is encoded in myths and stories. Mathematical relationships embedded in narratives that can be memorized and repeated. Practical skills are taught through apprenticeship, master to student, hands-on experience, because verbal instruction alone can't convey the nuances of complex techniques. Sacred traditions preserve fragments of pre-flood wisdom, even when the original context is lost. Rituals maintaining actions whose purposes are forgotten, but whose importance is remembered. New settlements emerge as populations find stable territories. permanent camps become villages. Agriculture is rediscovered or re-implemented as people recall or experiment with cultivation techniques. Some might be working from preserved knowledge, applying principles learned from elders who learned from their elders in unbroken chains, extending back before the catastrophe. Others might be discovering independently, trial and error reproducing what was once known but has been lost. The distinction becomes increasingly blurred as generations pass. Some survivors possess more knowledge than others. Perhaps they were specialists before the catastrophe. Astronomers, architects, agricultural experts. Perhaps they were simply fortunate to receive teaching from those who knew. They appear to less knowledgeable populations as something more than human. Teachers whose understanding seems miraculous, whose capabilities appear godlike in comparison to those who've lost or never possessed such knowledge. They share techniques for agriculture, architecture, astronomy, governance, and they're remembered, transformed through retellings into the civilizing heroes, the culture bringers, the gods who descended after the flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Gradually, over centuries and millennia, civilization re-establishes itself. The Fertile Crescent sees agricultural communities forming, applying knowledge of irrigation and crop management that seems sophisticated for supposedly primitive farmers. The Indus Valley develops urban planning with standardized measurements, suggesting centralized authority and mathematical understanding. China cultivates rice using techniques requiring detailed knowledge of seasonal flooding and soil management. Mesoamerica domesticates maize through selective breeding that demands understanding of genetics, even if the theoretical framework differs from modern biology. These early civilizations show puzzling features that make more sense if they're drawing on preserved rather than discovering from scratch. Sophisticated astronomical knowledge from earliest periods. Mathematical constants appearing in monuments without evidence of the developmental process that should have preceded their discovery. Construction techniques that modern engineers struggle to replicate, appearing suddenly, fully formed, as if builders were following instructions rather than experimenting. The emotional experience of this rebuilding spans generations. Early survivors carry grief for what was lost, frustration at possessing knowledge they can't implement because the infrastructure doesn't exist. Their children know only stories of the world before, second-hand accounts they half believe and half dismiss. Their grandchildren receive myths and legends, tales that seem exaggerated, impossible claims about vanished sophistication. By the time great-great-grandchildren hear these stories, they've transformed into religious narratives, accounts of golden ages and divine judgment, practical information encoded in symbolic language that preserves meaning while obscuring literal truth. From caves and ruins they climbed back toward civilization. Slower this time, forgetting more with each generation, but carrying forward enough fragments to eventually light the world again. The clear memories became hazy, recollections became mythological traditions, became the stories we're examining now, trying to extract truth from layers of embellishment and time. They rebuilt. They persisted. They preserved enough to ensure their descendants would eventually create civilizations that could ask these questions, that could wonder what came before, that could recognize in ancient myths the possibility that history is longer and stranger than we've imagined.
We've traveled through deep time together, examining layers of evidence like archaeologists, excavating a site, brushing away dust from artifacts that don't quite fit where we find them. We've listened to myths that span oceans and millennia, stories too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, yet too fragmentary to accept as definitive history. We've stood at the intersection of geology and legend, where rocks preserve violence and cultures preserve memory, and asked whether these separate witnesses might be testifying to the same events. The evidence supporting sophisticated pre-flood societies exists, though it remains circumstantial rather than conclusive. Sea levels did rise catastrophically, inundating vast coastal territories where logic suggests populations would have concentrated. Climate change did occur suddenly enough to devastate ecosystems and drive species to extinction. Archaeological anomalies do appear in contexts that challenge conventional timelines. Structures demonstrating precision we struggle to replicate. Knowledge appearing without apparent developmental progression. Capabilities that seem anachronistic in their sophistication. And the myths are genuinely, remarkably consistent across cultures that never contacted each other.
preserving accounts of catastrophic flooding and lost civilizations that align with what geology and paleontology reveal about events 12,000 years ago. But the objections remain legitimate. Definitive proof is absent. The cities haven't been found, the machines haven't been excavated. The technological debris that any advanced civilization should leave behind remains elusive. Alternative explanations exist for most anomalies. Mainstream archaeology offers prosaic accounts that don't require invoking lost knowledge or vanished sophistication. And the danger of confirmation bias is real, the tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support preferred conclusions, rather than following data wherever it leads. What we can say with reasonable confidence is limited but significant. Catastrophic events occurred approximately 12,000 years ago. Human populations experienced severe disruption, possibly reducing to a genetic bottleneck of just thousands of individuals worldwide. Knowledge can indeed be lost through civilizational collapse. We have historical examples of sophisticated understanding vanishing when the societies that maintained it fell. Ancient peoples were more capable, more sophisticated, more knowledgeable than conventional narratives often credit, and our understanding of deep prehistory remains profoundly incomplete, with vast territories now underwater, never systematically investigated by archaeologists. What remains uncertain is equally significant. The exact nature and extent of pre-flood civilizations. Were they comparable to early historical societies like Sumer and Egypt? Or did they possess even greater capabilities? The precise mechanisms of catastrophe. Cosmic impact versus terrestrial triggers versus cascading combinations of both. The degree of knowledge preservation versus independent rediscovery. How much did survivors transmit, and how much did later cultures reinvent? Whether myths preserve literal historical memories, or represent mythologized interpretations of natural disasters that were real but not necessarily as described. The epistemological challenges are profound. How do we know what we think we know about periods with no written records, about populations whose remains might rest beneath hundreds of feet of ocean? What constitutes sufficient evidence for extraordinary claims without setting the bar so high that genuine discoveries would be dismissed? How do we balance healthy skepticism against premature rejection of unconventional theories? How do we acknowledge the limits of our knowledge without descending into agnosticism that treats all claims as equally uncertain? Perhaps the value lies not in solving the mystery, but in maintaining it. Not knowing everything preserves wonder and curiosity. Acknowledging vast gaps in our understanding keeps inquiry alive. The mystery itself has worth. It reminds us how much we don't know, how much remains to discover, how provisional our certainties actually are. And our inquiry matters regardless of whether we ever find definitive answers. Studying potential pre-flood civilizations teaches us about knowledge preservation across catastrophic divides. It highlights civilizational fragility and the importance of maintaining both high and low technology. It motivates archaeological investigation, especially of submerged continental shelves we've barely explored. It encourages taking ancient traditions seriously as potential historical sources, rather than dismissing them as primitive superstition. We've journeyed through time and evidence and myth, and emerged not with certainty, but with better questions. And sometimes, the questions matter more than answers. Sometimes, maintaining the capacity to wonder is more valuable than reaching conclusions. Sometimes, the greatest gift is recognizing how much we don't know and remaining curious about it. There's something about lost civilizations that touches us in places intellectual analysis can't reach. A sense of loss for something we never personally experienced. A feeling of connection to ancient peoples across vast expanses of time. A simultaneous comfort and discomfort in imagining that our civilization might not be the pinnacle of human achievement, that we might not be the first to reach these heights, that everything we've built could vanish as completely as what came before. These ideas resonate because they challenge assumptions we didn't know we were making. Modern thinking assumes linear progress. Ancient peoples were primitive. We're advanced. The future will be more advanced still. But this narrative is recent, a product of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. Before that, many cultures viewed time as cyclical, ages of rise and fall, creation and destruction, forgetting and remembering in endless cycles. The Hindu Yugas, the Mayan world ages, the Greek progression through golden, silver, bronze and iron ages, each one declining until catastrophe forces reset. Which view fits the evidence better? Linear progress struggles to explain the sophistication appearing suddenly in earlier civilizations. the knowledge that seems inherited rather than discovered, the patterns of advancement followed by loss rather than steady improvement. Cyclical time accommodates these patterns naturally, of course. Civilizations rise and fall. Of course, knowledge is lost and rediscovered. Of course, we see fragments of previous cycles embedded in later ones. But what does cyclical time mean for purpose and meaning? If everything can be lost, if civilizations rise only to fall and be forgotten, does that make our achievements futile? Or does it make them more precious precisely because they're impermanent, because they require deliberate preservation, because nothing persists without effort and intention? Does it encourage nihilism? Why build when it will only crumble? Or does it motivate creation of meaning despite impermanence, legacy despite mortality? Perhaps civilizational amnesia works as metaphor for personal forgetting. Individuals forget inconvenient truths, traumatic experiences, hard-won lessons. Societies do the same on larger scales. Knowledge preservation requires active effort against entropy and forgetting. What we choose to remember and forget shapes who we become and what futures are possible. And often we forget the most important things, the warnings, the mistakes, the wisdom purchased through suffering. Because remembering is uncomfortable and forgetting is easy. The myths might represent more than historical memory. Perhaps they're also archetypal human experiences encoded in narrative form, the flood as metaphor for overwhelming change that destroys familiar worlds. The survivors as symbols of resilience, of the human capacity to endure impossible circumstances. The lost golden age as psychological projection of paradise lost, the universal human sense that something precious existed before our time and was lost before we could experience it. The cyclical destruction and renewal as reflection of natural patterns we observe everywhere, seasons, life cycles, death and rebirth embedded in every ecosystem. Engaging with these mysteries changes us if we let it, perhaps making us more humble about our own civilization's permanence, less certain that our achievements will endure, more aware that we're participants in patterns larger than ourselves, more respectful of ancient wisdom traditions that preserved knowledge across catastrophic divides, more conscious of our own vulnerability and the preciousness of what we know, more connected to the vast sweep of human history extending far beyond recorded civilization, to ancestors whose names are lost, but whose legacy persists in our DNA and our cultural inheritance. The particular poignancy of knowledge lost haunts those who contemplate it. Somewhere in our past, people knew things we've had to rediscover or that remain unknown. Libraries burned with contents never recorded elsewhere. Specialists died taking expertise to the grave. Civilizations fell, and their understanding fell with them. And we might be in the same position, possessing knowledge that future peoples will have to rediscover after our own catastrophe, if catastrophe comes. The arrogance lies in assuming we're different, that our knowledge is secure, that loss can't happen to us because we're more advanced than those who came before. Maybe we're drawn to lost civilizations not because we want to solve the mystery, but because we see ourselves reflected in it, achievers who might achieve nothing permanent, builders who might see their buildings crumble, dreamers whose dreams might be forgotten, knowers who might lose what they know. The mystery of lost civilizations is ultimately the mystery of our own impermanence, writ large in history, our own mortality, extended to civilizational timescales. We return now to where we began, to the simple recognition that the world was once completely different. The coastlines weren't where they are now. The climate operated according to patterns that no longer exist. Species that are extinct walked landscapes that are drowned. And people who might have been more like us than we imagined, lived lives and built things and knew things that have mostly been lost to time and catastrophe and the simple entropy that erases everything eventually. What we've learned matters less than what we've remembered to question. The fragility of civilization, how quickly sophisticated societies can collapse, and how completely their achievements can be lost. The possibility of knowledge discovered and forgotten and rediscovered, the non-linear path of human understanding. The sophistication of ancient peoples who accomplished remarkable things with tools and techniques we struggle to understand. The reality of catastrophic change, that stable conditions don't persist forever, and adaptation can become impossible when change exceeds our capacity to respond. The consistency of human nature across vast time, Ancient peoples faced the same challenges of preserving knowledge, maintaining civilization, surviving disruption that we face now. This knowledge might change how we live, if we let it, perhaps making us more committed to preserving what we know in forms that could survive catastrophe. More respectful of traditional wisdom that survived when more sophisticated understanding was lost. More aware that our own civilization is fragile, more motivated to address existential risks before they become existential catastrophes. More humble about our achievements, recognizing that technological advancement doesn't guarantee permanence or wisdom. More connected to the vast human story, understanding that we're participants in something much larger and longer than our individual lives or our particular society. The perspective it offers on legacy and remembrance is profound. We're all participants in a story that began long before us and will continue long after. What we preserve and transmit matters beyond our own lifetimes. Civilizations are built by people who plant trees whose shade they'll never sit under, who preserve knowledge for descendants they'll never meet, who create meaning not for themselves, but for continuity that extends beyond any individual existence. And meaning comes partly from contributing to this continuity, even when continuity isn't guaranteed, even when we know that everything can be lost, even when we recognize our own impermanence. The paradox is that we've examined evidence and arguments, developed understanding and perspective, yet emerged with deeper appreciation of mystery rather than having solved it. And perhaps that's the greatest gift, maintaining wonder while deepening understanding, holding uncertainty while honoring what we do know, acknowledging limits while continuing to explore beyond them. The myths will persist, whether they're historical memories or archetypal stories, or both. They speak to something essential in human experience that transcends their literal truth or falsehood. The recognition that nothing lasts forever, that catastrophe is possible, that resilience matters, that knowledge is precious and fragile and must be deliberately preserved, that we're connected to those who came before and those who will come after through stories and genes and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. The cities sleeping beneath the waves will keep their secrets for now. The knowledge encoded in myths and monuments will continue inviting interpretation. The survivors who carried forward fragments of a lost world will remain nameless, their individual stories lost but their collective legacy visible in every civilization that followed. And we'll continue wondering whether we're the first to achieve sophistication, or just the latest in a cycle that extends far deeper into time than our history books acknowledge. What we take from this journey is both humility and hope. Humility in recognizing we don't know everything, that our civilization is fragile, that we might be wrong about fundamental assumptions we haven't even recognized we're making. But also hope in recognizing that humanity has survived catastrophes before, that knowledge can be preserved even through dark ages, that resilience and creativity persist across all eras, and that understanding our vulnerability might inspire the wisdom to avoid repeating ancient mistakes. The water still remembers what it covered, the stones still whisper what they witnessed, and somewhere in our bones we carry memories of a world we never knew but perhaps should never forget. Sleep now, and dream of coastlines that don't exist anymore, of stars positioned differently in older skies, of people who built and knew and hoped and feared just as we do, whose world ended but whose story continues in us, in the questions we ask, in the mysteries we preserve, in the knowledge we carry forward into whatever future awaits.